I was rushed to the emergency room unconscious and bleeding out. The hospital called my parents begging them to hurry, but my mother scoffed and said they could not make it because my brother had a recreational basketball game. Even after the surgeon warned them I might not survive the night, they never showed up. A week later, they finally walked into my hospital room only to find it completely empty. A single note sat on the stripped bed. When they read it all, the color drained from their faces as they realized they had just lost everything. My name is Kendra, and I am 35 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever realized your family only loves you when you are useful to them. It was a Tuesday evening when my body decided to turn against me. I had just walked into my downtown condo after a grueling 12-hour shift directing global logistics for a major firm. I dropped my briefcase by the door and kicked off my heels, feeling the deep exhaustion settling into my bones. The pain started as a dull ache low in my abdomen, something I tried to brush off as severe cramps or just the physical toll of a high-stress career. I poured a glass of water and told myself to just breathe through it. But within minutes, the dull ache morphed into a sharp, searing agony that dropped me straight to the hardwood floor. The wood was freezing against my cheek as I curled into a tight fetal position. I could not breathe and I could not think. My vision blurred at the edges, tunneling into a terrifying darkness. Every single heartbeat felt like a jagged knife twisting inside my stomach. It was a ruptured ectopic pregnancy, though I did not know it at the time. I was bleeding internally, my life draining away right there in the foyer of my home. With trembling fingers, I managed to drag my phone out of my coat pocket. The bright screen swam before my eyes. I dialed 911. The emergency operator answered, but my voice was barely a whisper. I gasped out my address before the phone slipped from my sweaty grasp and the world faded entirely into black. Waking up was nothing like the movies portray. There was no gentle fluttering of eyelashes or soft, warm lighting. I was jolted into consciousness by the rhythmic, agonizing beep of a heart monitor and the harsh, blinding fluorescent glare of the intensive care unit. My mouth tasted like dry cotton and copper. A heavy tube scratched the back of my throat, and a maze of wires tethered my arms and chest to a massive wall of medical machines. The pain in my abdomen was a dull, constant throb, masked slightly by whatever heavy narcotics they were pumping directly into my veins. But worse than the physical pain was the overwhelming, crushing silence of the room. I slowly turned my head, expecting to see a familiar face. A worried mother pacing the floor. A terrified father waiting for me to open my eyes. Instead, I saw nothing but empty visitor chairs and blank, sterile walls. I was entirely alone. For a brief, naive moment, I convinced myself they simply had not arrived yet. Traffic was always terrible downtown, and parking at the hospital was a nightmare. They were probably in the lobby arguing with the front desk receptionist right now. I clung to those excuses because the alternative was simply too devastating to accept. The heavy wooden door pushed open, and a man in green scrubs walked in holding a clipboard. He looked exhausted with dark, heavy circles under his eyes, but his expression softened into genuine relief when he saw me awake. He introduced himself as Dr. Sterling, the trauma surgeon, who had been elbow-deep in my abdomen just hours prior. He explained the ruptured ectopic pregnancy, gently detailing how close it had been. I had lost a massive amount of blood. He paused, his eyes dropping to the clipboard. You flatlined in the ambulance on the way here, Kendra. The paramedics had to revive you. We rushed you straight into emergency surgery to stop the internal bleeding. It was touch and go for a very long time. The gravity of his words settled over me like a lead blanket. I had died. My heart had stopped beating in the back of an ambulance. I took a shallow breath, wincing at the sharp pull of the surgical stitches. Are my parents here? I asked, my voice raspy and weak. Did you call them? Dr. Sterling shifted his weight, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, suddenly finding the linoleum floor fascinating. We did call your emergency contacts, he said carefully. We called the numbers listed for your mother Yvonne and your father Calvin. I asked if they were in the waiting room. I asked why they had not come back to see me yet. Dr. Sterling sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. Kendra, he started, his voice thick with awkward pity. I spoke to your mother directly. Our policy for critical trauma cases is to record outbound emergency calls for legal purposes. I tried to impress upon her the severe reality of your condition. I told her you were in critical condition and might not make it through the night. He stopped talking. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. What did she say? I demanded, ignoring the sharp pain radiating through my core. Play the recording. Dr. Sterling hesitated, shaking his head. He tried to tell me I needed to rest and that it could wait, but I insisted. I needed to know the truth. Reluctantly, he pulled his hospital-issued smartphone from his pocket, navigated to the secure call log, and pressed play. He held the speaker up. The audio was crisp and clear. I heard Dr. Sterling introduce himself, explaining my collapse, the ambulance ride, the internal bleeding, and the emergency surgery. Then my mother Yvonne spoke. Her voice echoed through the sterile hospital room. She did not sound panicked. She did not sound terrified for her daughter's life. She sounded deeply irritated. An ectopic what? Yvonne huffed over the speaker. Look, she probably just has a bad stomach ache. She always exaggerates everything to get attention. Tell her to take some Advil and sleep it off. We cannot come down there right now anyway. Jamal has his adult league basketball championship tonight. Chelsea dropped the kids off with us so she could get front row seats, and we need to watch them. We will come tomorrow if she is still there. If she is still there. The recording ended with a sharp click. Dr. Sterling pocketed the phone, refusing to meet my eyes. He mumbled something about checking my chart and practically fled the room, unable to bear the sheer humiliation radiating from my hospital bed. I lay there staring at the blank ceiling. My own mother was told her daughter had died in an ambulance and was currently fighting for her life in an intensive care unit, and her response was to complain about being inconvenienced. My 38-year-old brother Jamal was playing in a recreational basketball league, a meaningless amateur game. His white wife Chelsea, a woman who had never worked a single day in her life and treated my parents like unpaid childcare workers, needed to sit in the front row to cheer him on. That was their priority. A shiny plastic trophy and Chelsea's entertainment mattered more than my actual survival. The crushing weight of the realization pressed down on my chest harder than the surgical incisions. This was not a new dynamic. This was simply the most lethal manifestation of it. My mind drifted back to my high school graduation. I had been sitting in the folding chair on the football field, waiting to hear my name called as salutatorian. I had scoured the bleachers for my family, eager to see my parents' smiling faces. But they had already left. Jamal had gotten into a minor fender bender in the school parking lot, completely unharmed, but extremely agitated that his sports car had a scratched bumper. My parents abandoned my graduation ceremony before I ever crossed the stage because Jamal needed emotional support for a scratched bumper. They had always idolized Jamal, the golden boy, who could do no wrong while I was the workhorse they only acknowledged when they needed something fixed or funded. I had spent my entire adult life trying to earn their respect. I climbed the corporate ladder, secured a highly paid director position, built a solid financial portfolio, and never asked them for a single dime. Jamal, meanwhile, bounced from one failed business venture to another, constantly draining their retirement accounts and demanding constant praise for his mere existence. And they gave it to him willingly. They gave him everything, including the night I almost died. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound keeping me company as the darkness outside my hospital window shifted into the early hours of morning. I had survived the night entirely alone. The physical agony of the surgery was absolutely nothing compared to the profound, hollow ache of understanding my true place in my family. I was a ghost to them, a convenient shadow to be ignored until needed. I slowly turned my head toward the small plastic tray table beside my bed. My personal belongings had been placed there in a clear plastic bag by the paramedics. Inside the bag, my cell phone screen suddenly lit up, vibrating against the plastic. For a brief, pathetic second, my heart leaped. Maybe it was them. Maybe the basketball game was over, and the kids were asleep, and they finally felt a pang of guilt. Maybe my mother was calling to apologize, crying, and realizing how close she came to losing her daughter forever. I reached through the bed rails, my fingers trembling as I grasped the phone. I hit the power button. The screen illuminated my dark room. It was not a message asking if I was alive. It was not a frantic voicemail begging for an update on my surgery. It was a notification from the family group chat, and what I saw next would be the final catalyst that destroyed our family forever. The darkness of the intensive care unit pressed down on my chest heavier than the surgical bandages wrapping my abdomen. For hours, the only sound keeping me tethered to reality was the steady mechanical beeping of my heart monitor. Every breath I took felt like shattered glass scraping against my ribs, a sharp and punishing reminder that I was still alive. I had survived the ruptured ectopic pregnancy. I had survived flatlining in the back of an ambulance. But lying there in the suffocating quiet of that sterile room, I realized I was entirely alone. The physical agony was blinding, but it was nothing compared to the slow, creeping realization that my family had left me here to die. Throughout the night, a rotation of nurses came in to check my vitals, adjust my intravenous drip, and empty my catheter. Each of them wore the same expression of thinly veiled pity. They averted their eyes when they spoke to me, keeping their voices hushed and overly gentle. They knew. In a hospital, gossip spreads faster than a virus, and by midnight, the entire ward knew about the woman in bed 4 whose parents refused to show up for her emergency surgery because they had to attend a recreational basketball game. Their pity burned me far worse than the iodine and the surgical incisions. I wanted to scream at them to stop looking at me like I was a tragic charity case, but I lacked the physical strength to even raise my voice. Instead, I lay perfectly still, staring at the white ceiling tiles and letting the cold truth wash over me. This was not an isolated incident. Tonight was simply the ultimate, undeniably fatal conclusion to a lifetime of second-place finishes. I remembered my high school graduation with crystal clarity. I was the class salutatorian delivering a speech to an auditorium of thousands. I had scoured the bleachers for my parents, searching for a single proud smile. I found 2 empty seats instead. They had left before I even crossed the stage because my older brother Jamal had gotten into a minor fender bender in the school parking lot. He was completely unharmed, but his sports car, the one they bought for him, had a scratched bumper. Jamal needed emotional support, they told me later. He was traumatized by the scratch. I walked home in my cap and gown that day. When I bought my first downtown condo entirely with my own money, they promised to come to the housewarming. They never showed up because Chelsea, my brother's new white wife, decided that was the exact weekend she needed my mother to help her pick out paint swatches for their guest bathroom. I was never a daughter to Yvonne and Calvin. I was a utility, a silent workhorse who existed only to fix things and fund things when Jamal inevitably failed. Morning finally broke, painting the hospital room in a pale gray light. My work tote bag, which the paramedics had grabbed from my foyer when they loaded me onto the stretcher, sat on a small plastic chair in the corner. My cell phone rested on the rolling tray table beside my bed, right where a nurse had placed it hours ago. I stared at the black screen for a long time. A naive, pathetic part of me still hoped. I hoped that maybe the game had run late, and they had fallen asleep, and they would be rushing through the hospital doors any second now, with apologies and tears. I took a shallow, painful breath and reached for the phone. The cool metal felt heavy in my weak grip. I pressed the power button. The screen illuminated, flooding my eyes with bright light. There were 0 missed calls. There were 0 voicemails. There was not a single text message from my mother asking if I had survived the night. There was nothing from my father asking what hospital I was in. The only notification on my screen was a string of unread messages in our family group chat. The chat was ironically titled, "Adam's Family Strong." I unlocked the phone and opened the thread. The most recent messages were all from Chelsea. She was not asking about my emergency room visit. She was complaining about the logistics of Jamal's basketball game. Her first text, sent precisely around the time I was being cut open on an operating table, read, "The valet at the sports complex is literally a joke. Jamal is so stressed before tip-off. I had to walk 3 blocks in my new heels." The next message, sent an hour later, was a blurry photo of Jamal holding a cheap plastic trophy with a caption from my mother reading, "So proud of my champion." The final message, sent just 20 minutes ago, was again from Chelsea. She wrote, "Jamal is exhausted. We are heading to the steakhouse to celebrate. Calvin and Yvonne, you guys are buying right." I stared at the messages until the letters blurred together. They were going to a steakhouse. I had almost bled to death on my hardwood floor. My heart had literally stopped beating. And my family was eating premium ribeye to celebrate a 38-year-old man winning an amateur sports league. A chilling, absolute numbness settled over my heart. The desperate daughter inside me, the one who had spent 35 years begging for scraps of affection, quietly passed away in that hospital bed. She was replaced by something cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of mercy. Suddenly, the phone vibrated in my palm. The caller identification flashed brightly on the screen. It was my father, Calvin. I let it ring 3 times, listening to the steady hum of my medical machinery before I swiped to answer. I brought the phone to my ear, but did not say a word. Kendra, Calvin barked into the receiver. His voice was loud, rushed, and completely devoid of concern. He did not say hello. He did not ask how my stomachache was. He did not ask if I was alive. "Listen to me. We have a situation here. We are down at the Prime Cut Steakhouse celebrating your brother's massive victory, and there is a huge problem with the bill." I kept my voice dead and completely flat. "What kind of problem, Dad?" "Chelsea accidentally overdrew their joint account again," Calvin said, sighing heavily into the phone as if he were the one carrying the weight of the world. "And your mother and I left our main credit cards at the house because we rushed out the door to watch the kids. The bill is $4,000, Kendra." Jamal ordered the vintage champagne to celebrate. "The restaurant manager is threatening to call the police if we do not settle this right now. You need to wire me the money immediately." $4,000 for vintage champagne and steaks. While I was hooked to a blood transfusion monitor, I looked down at the surgical tape covering my abdomen. "Dad, I am in the hospital," I said, my voice quiet. Calvin scoffed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed in my ear. "Do not start with the dramatic excuses today, Kendra. Your mother said you had a stomach bug. Take a pill and deal with it later. Jamal is your brother. He is the champion today. He deserves to celebrate without this kind of humiliation." Chelsea is crying in the bathroom because the waiter was rude to her about the declined card. "Family helps family, Kendra. Do not be selfish today. We need that transfer right now." There it was, the ultimate manipulation. The weaponization of family loyalty designed to empty my pockets to fund their delusions. They truly believed I was nothing more than an open vault meant to finance Jamal's life. They believed they could discard me to die and then call me the next morning to pay for their luxury meals. I closed my eyes. The coldness inside me solidified into pure steel. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not tell him that I had flatlined or that I was currently tethered to a wall of life support equipment. Letting them hear my pain would only give them power. Instead, I gave them exactly what they wanted to hear. "You are right, Dad," I said, my voice dangerously smooth. "Family helps family. Give me 5 minutes. I will take care of everything." "Thank you," Calvin sighed, instantly relieved. "Make it fast. The manager is hovering." I ended the call. The silence in the hospital room returned, but it no longer felt suffocating. It felt like the calm before a devastating storm. I placed my phone on the tray table and, carefully ignoring the burning pain in my core, leaned over the side of the bed. I unzipped my work tote bag and pulled out my corporate laptop. I balanced the heavy machine on my lap, resting it carefully above my surgical wounds. I flipped the screen open and waited for the familiar glow of the login portal. My family thought I was just a mid-level director of logistics who managed shipping routes. They thought I made a comfortable salary, which gave them the right to demand my money whenever Jamal failed. What they did not know was the exact nature of my financial portfolio. I was not just a corporate director. For the past 5 years, using my logistics income and a series of smart investments, I had built a substantial private lending portfolio. I operated under a shielded corporate entity to protect my assets from my parents' constant demands. 3 years ago, when Jamal begged the family for money to open a high-end luxury fitness club, traditional banks laughed him out of their offices. His credit was terrible and his business plan was an absolute joke. Calvin and Yvonne had pleaded with their wealthy contacts to secure a commercial line of credit for him. They found a silent underwriter willing to back the venture, holding the gym afloat with a massive revolving credit line. I logged into my secure server. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the firewalls and opening the main client ledger. I scrolled down past dozens of successful corporate accounts until I found the file for Jamal's fitness club. I clicked on the account details. I was the silent underwriter. I was the invisible safety net keeping his entire fraudulent empire from collapsing into dust. I provided the credit line that kept his gym open. I funded the very business that allowed Chelsea to act like a wealthy socialite. They were currently sitting in a steakhouse crying over a declined personal debit card, completely unaware that their entire financial existence depended on the woman they had abandoned to die. I navigated to the administrative controls for Jamal's commercial credit line. The account was severely overdrawn, carrying a massive balance that he was barely paying the interest on. He used this specific business line to fund his lifestyle, to buy his expensive suits, and to pay for his lavish dinners by writing them off as corporate expenses. I knew he was planning to use this exact credit line to pay the $4,000 steakhouse bill. He was just waiting for me to wire the cash to cover the immediate personal overdraft so he could shuffle the funds around. I stared at the green button on the screen labeled Active Status. I thought about the cold floor of my foyer. I thought about the paramedics shouting that they were losing my pulse. I thought about my mother telling the doctor that my ruptured organ was just a stomach ache and that a basketball game was more important. I moved the cursor over the administrative controls. I selected the option for immediate permanent account suspension due to breach of contract and high-risk default. A warning prompt flashed on the screen, asking if I was sure I wanted to terminate the credit line. Terminating this line would instantly freeze all associated business cards, halt all automated vendor payments, and trigger a cascade of financial defaults that would ruin his company within days. I did not hesitate. I clicked Confirm. The screen refreshed. The status indicator for Jamal's commercial empire turned from a vibrant, healthy green to a flat, dead red. The available credit balance instantly dropped to 0. The freeze was absolute and irreversible without my direct authorization. I slowly closed the laptop and pushed it back into my tote bag. I sank back against the hospital pillows, listening to the steady rhythm of my heart monitor. In a few minutes, Jamal was going to hand his sleek black corporate card to the restaurant manager. The machine was going to decline it. Calvin was going to check his bank app, waiting for my wire transfer that was never going to arrive. They were going to stand in the middle of that expensive steakhouse, entirely out of money, completely humiliated and completely trapped. And this was only the beginning of what I had planned for them. The glow of the laptop screen felt harsh against my tired eyes, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me wide awake. I ignored the dull throbbing in my abdomen and the sterile smell of the hospital room. My fingers moved across the keyboard with muscle memory, navigating away from the banking portal and opening a heavily encrypted server. It was the secure login for my private shell corporation, Apex Holdings. I had established Apex 5 years ago when I first realized my family would never respect my success or protect my well-being. Back then, I had just received a massive promotion and a significant stock payout from my global logistics firm. I knew if my parents found out about the money, they would immediately demand I surrender it to fund whatever ridiculous dream Jamal was currently chasing. So I hid my wealth. I hired an ironclad corporate attorney and created a blind trust that funneled my investments into commercial real estate. Right around that same time, Jamal had pitched his grand idea for a luxury fitness club to my parents. He sat at their dining room table, talking about imported Italian marble in the locker rooms, eucalyptus-infused towels, and organic smoothie bars. My parents ate up every single word. They drained a massive chunk of their retirement savings to help him secure a prime location in a bustling, newly renovated commercial plaza downtown. What none of them knew was that I was the one who had quietly purchased that entire commercial plaza just 6 months prior. I became Jamal's landlord completely by coincidence, but when his broker submitted the lease application to my property management firm, I instructed them to approve it immediately. I wanted a front row seat to his inevitable failure, and I wanted to ensure my family's financial recklessness remained contained within a system I controlled. Now staring at the screen from my hospital bed, I opened the financial ledgers for the plaza. The numbers painted a pathetic and infuriating picture. While Jamal was out playing recreational basketball and ordering vintage champagne, his luxury gym was bleeding money from every conceivable angle. According to the current ledger, he was exactly 3 months behind on his rent. Late fees were piling up daily, and the utility companies had already issued multiple final warnings. He was drowning in debt while parading around the city like a successful entrepreneur. But what made the situation truly devastating was the security deposit agreement. When Jamal first applied for the lease, his personal credit history was a complete disaster. My property manager had correctly demanded a wealthy cosigner and substantial collateral to mitigate the risk. I clicked on the scanned lease agreement, pulling up the final signature page. There, sitting in stark black ink, were the signatures of my mother Yvonne and my father Calvin. They had blindly trusted their golden child so much that they put up their fully paid-off suburban family home as collateral to secure his commercial lease. If Jamal defaulted on his rent, Apex Holdings had the absolute legal right to place a lien on their house and initiate foreclosure proceedings to recoup the losses. They had literally bet their shelter on a man who could not even pay for his own celebratory steak dinner. The profound stupidity of it all washed over me. I was lying in an intensive care unit with staples in my stomach, recovering from a near-death experience, while my family was busy drinking champagne they could not afford on a credit line I had just severed, all while living in a house they had legally surrendered to my corporation. The stark contrast between my physical agony and their gluttonous entitlement was almost poetic. A nurse quietly stepped into the room to check my vitals, offering me a sympathetic smile as she recorded my blood pressure. I gave her a weak nod, waiting until she left to turn my attention back to the screen. Suddenly, the quiet of the medical ward was broken by the sharp buzzing of my phone resting on the laptop keyboard. The screen lit up with a barrage of text messages. It was not my father this time. It was Chelsea, my entitled sister-in-law. I watched the text bubbles pop up one after another, fast and furious. The first text read, "Jamal's card just declined at the steakhouse in front of his entire team. We are completely humiliated. The waiter actually took the champagne back and people are staring." The second text arrived seconds later. "Did you wire the money yet? Calvin said you were handling it. Why is it taking so long? You know we have plans after this. Stop dragging your feet, Kendra." Then came the third text, dripping with the classic gaslighting she and my mother always used to keep me in line. "You know how stressed Jamal is about his business right now. He works so hard to provide for us and you cannot even do this one simple favor quickly. Stop being so selfish, Kendra. You always have to make everything about you. Do not ruin this night for him. Send the money right now or I am telling your mother how unsupportive you are being." I read the words over and over, letting the pure toxicity of her message sink into my brain. Stop being so selfish. You know how stressed he is. I looked down at the intravenous lines taped to the back of my hand. I thought about the trauma surgeon telling me I had flatlined in the ambulance. I thought about the frantic paramedics pumping my chest to keep my heart beating, while my family complained about VIP parking at a gym. They did not care if I lived or died. They only cared that their personal ATM was currently out of service. I felt a calm, quiet smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy, but a smile of absolute ultimate liberation. I picked up the phone. I did not type out an angry paragraph explaining my medical trauma. I did not send a picture of my hospital bracelet. I did not defend myself or beg for their sympathy. I simply typed 5 words. Take care of yourselves. I hit send. Before Chelsea could reply or call, I went into the phone settings and switched the device to Do Not Disturb. The screen went black and silent. I set it aside and turned my full attention back to the Apex Holdings portal. I opened a new email draft addressed to my lead property manager. I kept the instructions clear, cold, and completely devoid of any emotion. I told him that the tenant occupying the luxury fitness club space was officially in breach of contract due to 90 days of unpaid rent. I authorized him to draft and serve an immediate 3-day pay or quit eviction notice. I also instructed him to prepare the heavy legal paperwork to activate the collateral clause against the guarantors Calvin and Yvonne. If Jamal did not come up with the entire back rent, plus the accumulated late penalties within 72 hours, I was officially calling in the lien on my parents' family home. I read over the email one last time, ensuring every legal directive was perfectly stated. Then I hit send and closed the laptop. The trap was set, and all I had to do now was rest heal and watch them spring it themselves. The heavy ICU door swung open, hitting the rubber wall stop with a dull thud. My best friend Tara marched into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. She looked like a woman preparing for war. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy knot, and her trench coat was hastily thrown over her yoga clothes. She stopped at the foot of my bed, taking in the monitors, the IV lines, and the sheer amount of medical tape covering my abdomen. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes filled with a furious protective sheen. "I did not even know you were here until I called your office," she said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Your assistant told me you had a medical emergency. I have been calling hospitals for 2 hours, Kendra. Why did your parents not tell me?" I gestured weakly to the empty chairs in the corner. "Because they are not here, Tara. They never came." Tara dropped her designer bag onto the floor. She pulled her phone out of her pocket, her screen glowing brightly. She marched over to the side of my bed and held the device up so I could see it. It was Chelsea's social media page. A fresh video played on an endless loop, showing Chelsea, Jamal, and my parents sitting at a sprawling brunch table covered in empty mimosa glasses and half-eaten plates of expensive steak and eggs. They were laughing. My mother was holding up a crystal flute, toasting to Jamal's amateur basketball victory. The caption read, "Celebrating our champion with the best family in the world." "They posted this 20 minutes ago," Tara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You are lying in an intensive care unit, surviving a ruptured organ, and they are out drinking bottomless mimosas. I am going down there. I know exactly which restaurant this is. I am going to walk right up to their table and scream so loud the entire city hears exactly what kind of monsters they are." She turned on her heel, ready to march right back out the door and burn their world to the ground. "Stop," I said, my voice lacking volume, but carrying enough cold authority to freeze her in her tracks. Tara spun around, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Kendra, they left you here to die. They are parading around town spending money while you are hooked up to machines. You cannot just let them get away with this." I adjusted the control button on my bed, raising my back a few inches. The movement sent a sharp spike of pain through my core, but I ignored it. I looked at my best friend, maintaining absolute eye contact. "If you go to that restaurant and scream at them, what happens?" I asked. "I will tell you exactly what happens. My mother will clutch her pearls and act like the victim. Jamal will step in front of her to play the protective son. They will tell the entire restaurant that I sent my crazy friend to harass them because I am bitter and jealous of Jamal's success. They will use your anger to feed their narrative. They will spend the next 5 years telling everyone that I am the dramatic, unstable sister who threw a tantrum because they missed one hospital visit." Tara gripped the metal railing of my bed, her knuckles turning white. "So we do nothing. We just let them win." I reached out and placed my hand over hers. The cold steel I had felt building inside me since last night was fully solidified now. "I am not letting them win, Tara. I am removing them from the game entirely. Yelling at them gives them an audience. Confronting them gives them an opportunity to play the victim. The only way to truly destroy a parasite is to completely sever its food supply and vanish." Tara's expression shifted from hot rage to deep focus. She knew me well enough to recognize the tone of my voice. It was the same tone I used when dismantling rival logistics companies during hostile corporate takeovers. She pulled up a chair and sat down, leaning close to the bed. "What is the plan?" she asked. "We are going to execute a cold surgical extraction," I explained. "I am going to disappear from their lives so completely they will question if I ever existed. But I need your help." "Name it," Tara said without a second of hesitation. "First, I need you to go to my condo," I instructed. "My keys are in the plastic bag on the tray table. I need you to pack all my important financial documents, my passport, and enough clothes for a month. Then I need you to contact my building concierge. Tell them I am breaking my lease effective immediately. Pay whatever penalties they demand from the emergency cash envelope in my safe. I want my unit completely emptied and cleaned by a professional service before the weekend." Tara nodded, pulling a small notepad from her purse and writing furiously. "Broken lease, documents, clothes. Where are you going to go?" "I own a property 3 states away," I replied, keeping my voice low. "A beachfront rental I bought through a shell corporation 2 years ago. My parents have absolutely no idea it exists. I am going to recover there. I am changing my phone number today. I am deleting my personal email addresses. I am wiping my social media presence clean. When they finally decide they have a spare moment to check on their daughter, they are going to find a disconnected number and an empty apartment." Tara stopped writing and looked up, a fierce smile slowly spreading across her face. "They are going to panic," she said. "Yes," I agreed. "But not because they miss me. They are going to panic because they are about to lose their house, and Jamal is about to lose his business, and their favorite scapegoat will be entirely out of reach. I have already set the legal gears in motion. By the time they realize I am missing, the walls will already be closing in on them. I am going to watch their entire financial reality crumble from a balcony hundreds of miles away." The door handle rattled, and Dr. Sterling walked in, breaking the intensity of our planning session. He looked at Tara, then down at my chart, his brow furrowed in medical concern. His eyes briefly flicked to the corner of the room, where the empty visitor chairs still sat, acting as a stark reminder of my isolation. "Kendra, your white blood cell count is stabilizing, but you lost a tremendous amount of blood," he said, pulling a pen from his pocket. "We need to keep you here for at least another week for observation. There is still a high risk of internal infection, and moving around too much could tear your internal sutures." I looked at Dr. Sterling and then looked at the clock on the wall. It was day 5 of my admission. 5 full days since I flatlined. 5 days of silence from my family, except for demands for money. I pushed the thin hospital blanket off my legs and swung them carefully over the side of the bed. The room spun for a brief second, and a hot flare of agony shot through my abdomen, but I locked my jaw and pushed through it. "I am discharging myself today," I said. Dr. Sterling stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Kendra, that is highly inadvisable. I cannot medically authorize you to leave this ward. You are nowhere near ready. Then bring me the against medical advice forms," I replied, my feet hitting the cold linoleum floor. "I understand the risks, Dr. Sterling. I will take full responsibility for my recovery, but I am leaving this hospital today." He opened his mouth to argue further, but he saw the absolute unyielding resolve in my eyes. He knew I was not a woman who could be swayed once a decision was made. With a heavy sigh, he nodded reluctantly and turned to leave the room to fetch the discharge paperwork. Tara immediately stepped up, wrapping a supportive arm around my waist as I steadied myself against the edge of the mattress. She did not coddle me. She knew I needed to do this. She reached into the plastic bag and pulled out the fresh clothes she had brought for me, carefully helping me navigate the painful process of getting dressed. Every movement was a battle, but the physical pain was completely overshadowed by the burning anticipation of my escape. I buttoned my coat over the thick surgical bandages, taking one last look around the sterile intensive care room that had served as the graveyard for my family loyalty. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled, and the monitors stood silent. I grabbed my work bag and looked at Tara. My voice was steady and completely devoid of warmth. "They said they will come when they have time. Let us make sure they arrive to a ghost." On day 7, the automatic sliding doors of the hospital lobby parted to admit 3 people who looked more suited for a Sunday brunch than an intensive care unit. I was already hundreds of miles away, breathing in the salty air of my beachfront sanctuary. But the head charge nurse, a woman named Brenda, who had held my hand during the worst of my physical pain, made sure to call Tara later that evening to deliver a highly detailed play-by-play of my family's arrival. Yvonne, Calvin, and Chelsea strolled through the sterile hospital corridors without a single ounce of urgency. They were holding large iced coffees, the condensation dripping onto the polished linoleum floors. Chelsea was loudly complaining that the barista had used regular milk instead of oat milk in her vanilla latte. Calvin was grumbling about the exorbitant daily rate of the hospital parking garage, muttering that I should reimburse him for the parking ticket since it was my fault they had to drive all the way downtown in the first place. Yvonne simply sighed and checked her perfect manicure, telling Calvin that they just needed to get in, get the signature, and get out before rush hour traffic hit the interstate. It had been an entire week since my heart stopped beating in the back of an ambulance. A full 7 days since a trauma surgeon sliced into my abdomen to save my life. And yet my family walked through the hospital completely unbothered by the fact that they had not spoken to me or checked on my medical status in nearly 160 hours. They did not stop at the front desk to ask for an update on my condition. They did not ask if I had been moved from the critical trauma ward to a standard recovery floor. They simply marched toward the room number Dr. Sterling had given them on the night I collapsed, assuming I would be lying there waiting patiently for their arrival. They pushed open the heavy wooden door to my room, expecting to find a compliant, desperate daughter. Instead, they walked into absolute silence. The room was completely sterile. The life support machines were powered down and pushed against the wall. The harsh fluorescent lights were turned off. The heavy hospital bed was perfectly made, the sheets tucked tight and stripped of any personal belongings. The room smelled of strong industrial bleach and clean laundry. It was the distinct, undeniable look of a room that had been permanently vacated. Yvonne stopped in this doorway, her iced coffee pausing halfway to her lips. She stared at the empty bed, her brow furrowing in irritation rather than panic. She did not gasp in horror or drop her drink in fear that I had passed away. Her first reaction was pure selfish annoyance. "Where did she go?" Yvonne huffed, turning around to look at the empty hallway. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Calvin. She always has to make things difficult. They probably moved her to a different floor, and now we have to waste time tracking her down." Calvin crossed his arms over his chest, his face turning a dark shade of red. "We do not have time for her childish games today, Yvonne. Jamal is waiting for us. We have exactly 2 hours to get this paperwork back to the loan officer before the bank closes for the weekend." Chelsea stepped into the room, clutching a thick blue commercial folder to her chest. She looked frantically around the empty space as if I might be hiding in the closet to avoid them. She tapped her designer nails against the cardboard folder, her breathing accelerating into genuine panic. "We need to find her right now," Chelsea demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. "You guys do not understand how bad it is. Jamal's entire credit line was completely frozen 2 days ago. He cannot even buy protein powder for the smoothie bar. The commercial landlord is completely unresponsive, and the bank said they will only approve an emergency bridge loan if Kendra signs as the primary guarantor. If we do not get her signature today, Jamal is going to lose the gym." That was the only reason they had finally decided to grace the hospital with their presence. They had not come to hold my hand or brush the hair out of my face. They had not come to apologize for choosing a recreational basketball game over my survival. They came because the financial trap I had set from my hospital bed had snapped shut, and they were bleeding out financially. Jamal's luxury fitness club was in a total freefall. The moment I permanently severed his commercial credit line, his entire fraudulent lifestyle hit a brick wall. Vendors were demanding cash on delivery. His automated payroll accounts were bouncing. He was backed into a corner, and his only way out was to take out a massive predatory bank loan. But because his credit was garbage, the bank demanded a wealthy co-signer. They needed my high corporate salary and my spotless credit score to secure the funds. They viewed me purely as a financial tool, a human signature pad meant to fix Jamal's mistakes. Calvin marched out of the empty room and stormed down the hallway toward the central nurses' station. Yvonne and Chelsea followed closely behind him, their expensive shoes clicking aggressively against the floor. They approached the high counter where Nurse Brenda was charting medications. "Excuse me," Calvin barked, leaning over the counter and attempting to use his physical size to intimidate the staff. "We are looking for Kendra Wilson. She was in room 412, but the bed is empty. What floor did you move her to? We are on a very tight schedule and we need to see her immediately." Brenda slowly closed the medical file in front of her. She looked up at Calvin, taking in his aggressive posture and the iced coffees resting in the hands of the women behind him. She recognized them instantly. The entire ward knew exactly who Calvin and Yvonne were. They were the parents who had abandoned their daughter to bleed out alone. Brenda did not smile. She did not offer a polite customer service greeting. She looked at them with absolute, unadulterated contempt. "Kendra Wilson is no longer a patient at this facility," Brenda stated, her voice cold and professional. Yvonne stepped forward, pushing past Calvin. "What do you mean she is no longer a patient? Was she transferred to a rehabilitation clinic? Just give us the address so we can go get her signature on these documents." "She was not transferred," Brenda replied, her gaze locking onto Yvonne. "Miss Wilson discharged herself against medical advice 2 days ago. She packed her bags and walked out the front doors of this hospital. She is gone." The color instantly drained from Chelsea's face. She clutched the blue folder containing the bank loan documents so tightly her knuckles turned white. "What do you mean she walked out?" Chelsea shrieked, dropping all pretense of manners. "She cannot walk out. She just had major surgery." "Where did she go? She has to sign these papers for Jamal. Her phone is going straight to voicemail, and her office said she is on indefinite medical leave. Where is she?" Brenda crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair. "I am a medical professional, not a private investigator," she said smoothly. "Miss Wilson's current location is not hospital business. Even if I knew where she was, federal privacy laws prohibit me from sharing that information with you. Especially considering she specifically removed you from her approved contact list before she departed." Calvin slammed his hand flat against the counter, making a box of pens jump. "You listen to me," he growled, pointing a thick finger at the nurse. "I am her father. I have a right to know where my daughter is. She is acting irrational and unstable. She needs her family right now." Brenda did not flinch. She let Calvin's empty threat hang in the silent air for a long, humiliating moment. Then she reached into the top drawer of her desk and pulled out a crisp, white envelope. It was the exact envelope I had handed to her before Tara helped me into the elevator. "She did not seem irrational to me," Brenda said, sliding the envelope across the counter until it bumped against Calvin's hand. "She seemed like a woman who finally realized she was fighting for her life completely alone. She asked me to give this to you when you finally found the time to show up." Calvin stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. Yvonne snatched it off the counter, ripping the top open with a jagged tear. She pulled out the single sheet of typed paper. Chelsea leaned over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the text desperately, hoping it was a forwarding address or a blank check. Yvonne unfolded the paper. Her eyes scanned the first line, and her jaw dropped. The arrogant, entitled posture she had carried into the hospital completely evaporated. She read the words aloud, her voice shaking as the reality of my message hit her like a physical blow. "I was dying." Yvonne read, her voice barely above a whisper. "You chose a basketball game. I am no longer here. Do not look for me." Calvin snatched the paper out of his wife's hands, refusing to believe the finality of the message. He read it again, his eyes widening as he reached the bottom of the page. He swallowed hard, the reality of his missing safety net suddenly crashing down on him. "What else does it say?" Chelsea demanded, stepping back as panic fully consumed her. "We need her signature, Calvin. If we do not have her signature today, the bank is going to reject the loan. Jamal is going to lose everything." "What else did she write?" Calvin looked up from the paper, his face turning an ashen gray. He looked at Yvonne, his eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying realization. There was only one sentence left on the paper, a postscript that carried the weight of an execution order. He read the final words out loud, letting them echo through the silent hospital hallway. "Check your mailbox." I sat on the sun-drenched balcony of my coastal retreat hundreds of miles away, sipping herbal tea and letting the ocean breeze wash over my healing body. While I watched the waves crash against the shore, my phone pinged with a secure message from Tara. She had eyes everywhere. Through her network and the meticulous updates from my property manager, I knew exactly how the rest of their afternoon unfolded. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had shattered their entire reality. Calvin gripped the steering wheel of his luxury sedan so tightly his knuckles turned a mottled white. The drive from the hospital back to their manicured suburban neighborhood was a suffocating vacuum of silence. Yvonne sat in the passenger seat staring blankly at the dashboard, her mind unable to process the sheer finality of the note she still clutched in her trembling hand. Chelsea sat in the back, texting Jamal furiously, her acrylic nails clicking against her phone screen like tiny, frantic drumbeats. They pulled into the sprawling driveway of the family home. Jamal was pacing on the front porch wearing expensive designer sweatpants he had bought with my shadow money. He rushed down the steps before Calvin even put the car in park, demanding the signed bank documents to save his gym. Instead, Calvin marched right past him toward the ornate brick mailbox at the end of the driveway. He yanked the heavy iron door open. Inside, resting perfectly centered, was a thick, certified legal parcel bearing the stark, embossed logo of Apex Holdings. Calvin tore the heavy cardboard open as he walked through the front door, spilling the contents out onto the foyer imported rug. The family gathered around him in the entryway, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Jamal kept asking for my signature, completely ignoring the legal documents in his father's hands. Calvin pulled out the first stack of papers. It was the formal eviction notice. He read the words aloud, his voice catching on the harsh legal terminology. 3-day notice to pay or quit. Immediate termination of the commercial lease for the luxury fitness club due to severe breach of contract and 90 days of delinquent payments. Jamal scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. He told Calvin it was just a scare tactic from a faceless landlord and that as soon as they handed the bank the new loan documents with my signature, the back rent would be paid. But Calvin was not listening to him. Calvin was staring at the second document in the stack. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out shell of a man. The paper shook violently in his grip. It was the notice of intent to foreclose. Yvonne snatched the paper from her husband's hands, her eyes scanning the dense paragraphs. The reality of the collateral clause they had blindly signed 3 years ago finally registered in her mind. Apex Holdings was not just kicking Jamal out of his gym, they were calling in the lien on the suburban house. Because Jamal had defaulted on his commercial lease, the guarantors were immediately responsible for the entire balance of the broken contract. The numbers printed in bold black ink were staggering. $150,000 in back rent, late fees, and breach of contract penalties, payable immediately in certified funds. If the balance was not settled within 72 hours, Apex Holdings would legally seize their home. Yvonne's knees buckled. She grabbed the edge of the entryway console table to keep from collapsing onto the hardwood floor. They had bet their entire shelter, their life savings, and their retirement on Jamal, and they had lost. The sheer gravity of the situation hit the room like a localized earthquake. Chelsea let out a piercing theatrical shriek. She threw her expensive leather handbag across the foyer, where it smashed into a decorative vase, shattering ceramic across the floor. She began to throw a massive violent tantrum, pointing her finger at Yvonne and Calvin. She screamed that this was all their fault for not securing the bank loan fast enough. Then she turned her venom toward me. She completely ignored the fact that Jamal had driven his own business into the ground by refusing to pay rent and funding their lavish lifestyle instead. She blamed my disappearance for their terrible luck. If Kendra had not selfishly vanished right when we needed her, we would have the loan money right now. Chelsea shrieked, her face turning a mottled red. She always does this. She always ruins everything just to get attention. She is punishing Jamal because she is jealous of his success. We need her signature today. Make her fix this, Jamal. Call her right now and tell her she is destroying our lives. Jamal pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands slick with cold sweat. His arrogant facade had completely melted away, replaced by the terrified realization that he was about to be homeless and broke. He dialed my number, pressing the phone so hard against his ear, it left a red mark. He waited for the familiar ring, waiting to unleash his usual barrage of guilt trips and demands. Instead, a sterile, robotic, automated voice filled the line. The number you have reached has been disconnected and is no longer in service. Jamal pulled the phone away from his face, staring at the black screen in absolute horror. He dialed it again. The same robotic voice echoed back. He tried my work cell phone. Disconnected. He tried my personal email. The message immediately bounced back as undeliverable. The absolute panic finally set in. I was not just ignoring their calls, I had digitally erased myself from their world. Jamal did not say a word to his screaming wife or his hyperventilating parents. He turned around, sprinted out the front door, and threw himself into his luxury sports car. He peeled out of the driveway, leaving thick black tire marks on the concrete. He broke every speed limit in the city, racing downtown toward my high-rise condominium building. He was convinced I was simply hiding inside, screening my calls to teach them a lesson. He believed that if he could just get in front of my face, he could charm, bully, and manipulate me into bailing him out just like he had done for his entire adult life. He slammed his car into the loading zone outside my building, completely ignoring the valet, and sprinted through the revolving glass doors into the polished marble lobby. He marched straight toward the secure elevator bank, fully intending to ride up to my penthouse floor and pound on the door until I answered. Before he could pass the security desk, the head concierge, a tall, imposing man named Marcus, stepped directly into his path. Marcus had worked in the building for years and knew exactly who Jamal was. He also knew exactly what my strict departure instructions were. "Excuse me, sir. You cannot go up there," Marcus said, his voice echoing with stern authority. "Move out of my way," Jamal demanded, trying to sidestep the heavy wooden security desk. "I am going up to see my sister. It is an absolute family emergency, and I do not have time to deal with building protocol today." Marcus did not budge an inch. He crossed his arms, blocking the path to the elevators completely. "That will be physically impossible," Sir Marcus replied, his tone icy and resolute. "Miss Wilson no longer resides in this building." Jamal froze, his arrogant momentum crashing into a solid wall of confusion. "What are you talking about? She owns the lease on that penthouse. She has lived here for 3 years. She is up there hiding from her phone calls, and I am going up to see her." Marcus reached under the desk and pulled out a small, thick logbook, placing it firmly on the counter. "Miss Wilson broke her lease yesterday morning. She paid the termination penalties in full in cash. A professional moving crew arrived at exactly noon and emptied the entire unit. A cleaning crew finished the sanitation process last night. The penthouse is completely bare, and the locks have already been changed. She is gone, sir. She left no forwarding address, no contact number, and explicit instructions that anyone inquiring about her whereabouts should be turned away." Jamal stared at Marcus, his breathing ragged and shallow. The reality of his situation was choking him. There was no secret bank account waiting to save him. There was no safety net to catch his fall. His luxury gym was gone. His parents' house was gone. His lifestyle was completely annihilated. Marcus reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a crisp white envelope, holding it out toward Jamal. "However, she did leave this specific envelope with me. She instructed me to hand it to you when you inevitably arrived, demanding her money." Jamal snatched the envelope from the concierge's hand. His fingers fumbled with the seal, tearing the paper in his frantic haste. He pulled out the single sheet of thick cardstock. There was no long explanation. There was no dramatic farewell. There were only 2 typed sentences perfectly centered on the page. "You always believed you were the self-made champion of this family. It is time to prove it." Jamal stared at the single sheet of thick cardstock, the printed words burning themselves into his retinas. "You always believed you were the self-made champion of this family. It is time to prove it." The paper trembled in his grip as the oxygen seemed to completely vanish from the sprawling marble lobby. He looked up at Marcus, the concierge, his face a mask of furious disbelief. "Where did she go?" Jamal demanded, his voice cracking as he slammed his hand against the polished granite of the security desk. "You cannot just let a woman who had major surgery pack up and disappear. She is sick. She is completely out of her mind. Tell me where she forwarded her mail. Marcus stood with his hands neatly folded behind his back, presenting a picture of absolute professional apathy. As I have already informed you, Sir Miss Wilson handled her departure with absolute clarity and legal precision. She left no forwarding address. She terminated all physical and digital ties to this property. Now I must ask you to leave the premises before I am forced to summon building security to escort you out. Jamal wanted to scream. He wanted to vault over the desk and tear the information from the concierge, but the looming presence of two broad-shouldered security guards near the glass revolving doors forced him to swallow his rage. He spun on his heel and marched back out into the blistering afternoon sun. The city streets were bustling with professionals leaving their offices, but Jamal felt entirely isolated. He practically collapsed into the leather driver's seat of his imported sports car, a vehicle he leased solely on the assumption that my endless stream of income would cover the massive monthly payments. He slammed the door shut, sealing himself inside the silent cabin. His hands shook uncontrollably as he pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed his mother. Yvonne answered on the first ring, her voice shrill and frantic over the roar of highway traffic. "Did you get the signature?" Yvonne practically screamed into the receiver. "Calvin is driving like a maniac and Chelsea will not stop crying. Tell me you have the paperwork, Jamal." The bank officer said he is locking his desk in exactly 40 minutes. She is gone. Jamal gasped, the reality finally crushing the air out of his lungs. "She broke her lease, Mom. She emptied her entire penthouse and paid the termination fees in cash." The concierge handed me a note. She completely vanished. There was a horrible, deafening silence on the other end of the line. When Yvonne finally spoke, her voice lacked its usual commanding arrogance. It was small and trembling with genuine terror. "What do you mean she vanished? She has a corporate job. She has a life here. People do not just vanish, Jamal." "She did," Jamal shouted, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. "She disconnected her phone. She wiped her email. The apartment is empty. She set us up, Mom. She cut my credit line and then she evaporated so we would be stuck with the fallout." Yvonne hung up the phone without another word. Back in their suburban home, the reality of the foreclosure notice sitting on their entryway table drove my mother into a state of absolute manic desperation. She could not accept that her silent, obedient workhorse had finally snapped its tether. She refused to believe that I had outsmarted them. She immediately launched into a frantic, tearful campaign to track me down, fully convinced she could bully the world into giving her what she wanted. She marched into Calvin's home office and pulled up my logistics firm on her laptop. She found the corporate directory and dialed the main headquarters, demanding to be connected to the Human Resources Department. When a polite representative answered, Yvonne immediately weaponized her tears, playing the role of the distraught, terrified mother. "You have to help me," Yvonne cried, forcing a dramatic sob into the phone. "My daughter is Kendra Wilson. She is a director in your shipping division. She just had emergency surgery and she is suffering from severe mental instability. She ran away from the hospital and we cannot find her. I need to speak to her immediate supervisor. I need her emergency contact files." The line was quiet for a moment before the representative spoke, her tone shifting from polite customer service to rigid corporate policy. "I am very familiar with Miss Wilson," the representative said coldly. "And I can assure you, she is not missing, nor is she mentally unstable. She submitted her formal resignation earlier this week." "Resigned?" Yvonne gasped, her manicured hand flying to her chest. "She cannot resign. She makes 6 figures. She negotiated a highly lucrative exit package and surrendered all company assets." The HR representative continued, completely unmoved by my mother's theatrics. "Furthermore, Miss Wilson explicitly flagged your phone number and your husband's name in our security system. She submitted a legal document strictly prohibiting us from sharing any of her forwarding information, financial payouts, or future employment details with her immediate family. We have been instructed to terminate this call and contact local authorities if you continue to harass this office." Yvonne dropped the phone onto the desk, staring blankly at the screen. The protective corporate wall I had built around my exit was entirely impenetrable. She tried dialing my former colleagues, hoping to find a weak link in my social circle. She called my old assistant. She called my department manager. She even tracked down the number for my favorite neighborhood coffee shop. Every single door slammed violently in her face. My colleagues either hung up immediately or informed her that I had moved out of state to pursue a private venture. I had erased my footprint in the city so thoroughly it was as if I had never existed at all. While Yvonne spiraled into a breakdown in her office, Jamal was experiencing his own personal hell sitting in his car outside my former building. His phone vibrated violently against the center console. It was an automated alert from the advanced security system installed at his luxury fitness club. The notification flashed across his screen in bright red letters. Unauthorized entry detected, main doors breached. Jamal scrambled to open the security application on his phone, hoping to pull up the live camera feeds to see who was breaking into his gym. The app loaded for a split second before kicking him back to the login screen. An error message popped up stating his administrative access had been permanently revoked. His breathing grew ragged as he opened the mobile browser and logged directly into the commercial tenant portal for the plaza. The dashboard, which usually displayed his monthly metrics and amenity schedules, was entirely blacked out. A massive digital banner dominated the center of the screen, bearing the silver crest of Apex Holdings. Jamal tapped the flashing icon in the center of the banner, downloading a heavily encrypted PDF document. He opened the file and his blood ran completely cold. It was a formal notice of seizure and liquidation. The document outlined in devastating legal detail exactly what was happening at his beloved gym. Apex Holdings had bypassed the standard 30-day waiting period by invoking a high-risk commercial default clause buried deep in the fine print of his lease. Because he had missed 3 consecutive rent payments and his primary credit line had been severed, the landlord had officially seized the property to mitigate their financial damages. Jamal read the bulleted list of actions already taken by the property management firm. The electronic locks on the front doors had been swapped and coded to a master key. Armed private security guards were currently standing inside the marble lobby, ensuring no equipment was removed from the premises. But the final paragraph was the absolute death blow to his ego. Apex Holdings had officially scheduled a public commercial auction to recoup the $150,000 in unpaid rent and penalties. The auction was set to take place in exactly 14 days. Every single asset inside the building was going to be sold to the highest bidder. The imported Italian marble reception desk, the custom-built weight machines, the inventory of organic supplements, the commercial-grade smoothie blenders. Everything he had bought to make himself look like a visionary entrepreneur was going to be liquidated for pennies on the dollar. Jamal let out a guttural scream, punching the dashboard of his car so hard he cracked the plastic casing around the radio. His entire empire was turning to dust in front of his eyes. He was losing his business, his parents were losing their home, and the sister he had treated like a disposable wallet held all the power. Suddenly, the screen on his phone refreshed automatically. The liquidation document vanished, replaced by a stark white page with a single notification blinking in the center. It was a direct encrypted message from the corporate office of Apex Holdings. Jamal wiped the sweat from his forehead and tapped the icon, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The message was signed directly by the elusive chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. It was not a standard property management update. It was a formal, non-negotiable summons. Apex Holdings has temporarily suspended the public auction of the fitness club assets, the message read, the harsh black text glaring back at him. The CEO requires a mandatory in-person mediation meeting to discuss a final settlement regarding the outstanding debt and the active lien on the residential property acting as collateral. Jamal felt a tiny, desperate flicker of hope ignite in his chest. A mediation meant a chance to negotiate. It meant he could use his legendary charm to talk his way out of this disaster. He could promise future profits, leverage his supposed business acumen, and convince this faceless CEO to give him an extension. He scrolled down to read the terms of the meeting, and his stomach instantly plummeted. The final stipulations of the summons were absolute and terrifyingly specific. This mediation is strictly closed, the document stated. Legal representation is expressly forbidden. Financial advisors are expressly forbidden. The only individuals permitted to enter the boardroom are the primary tenant, Jamal Adams, and the legal guarantors of the lease, Calvin and Yvonne Adams. Failure to attend this meeting exactly as instructed will result in the immediate auction of all commercial assets and the immediate foreclosure of the residential collateral. Jamal stared at the screen, the quiet hum of his car engine, the only sound in the suffocating cabin. The CEO of the company holding the deed to his parents' house did not want to talk to lawyers. They wanted the three of them isolated, unprotected, and completely at their mercy. He had absolutely no idea who was running Apex Holdings, but as he read the time and location for the mandatory meeting, he realized he was about to walk his entire family directly into the slaughterhouse. While Jamal sat suffocating in the leather interior of his leased sports car, staring at the mediation summons, my reality could not have been more completely opposite. I was sitting on the expansive, sun-drenched balcony of a luxury beachfront rental 3 states away. The rhythmic sound of the Atlantic Ocean crashing against the pristine white shoreline was a stark, beautiful contrast to the chaotic war zone I had deliberately left behind in the city. I wore a plush cashmere robe, my bare feet resting on the warm wooden planks of the deck. A mug of expensive loose-leaf chamomile tea sat steaming on the glass table next to my encrypted laptop. The salty ocean breeze blew through my hair, carrying away the last lingering remnants of the suffocating stress that had defined my entire adult life. For 35 years, I had been the designated shock absorber for the Addams family. I was the silent, obedient workhorse expected to fund their delusions of grandeur, absorb their emotional abuse, and fix every single disaster Jamal managed to create. I had spent my life walking on eggshells, shrinking myself down to ensure Jamal could feel like a giant. But looking at the digital dashboard on my laptop screen, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound icy satisfaction. My phone chimed softly against the glass table. It was a secure message from Tara, my fiercely loyal former assistant, and the only person in the city who knew the full extent of my master plan. Tara was my eyes and ears on the ground, managing the flow of information with military precision. He received the mediation summons, Tara wrote, followed by a smiling emoji. Marcus confirmed he looked like he was going to throw up right there in the lobby. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, letting the warm liquid soothe my throat. The trap was holding perfectly. A new notification flashed in the corner of my screen. It was an alert from the specialized server I had set up months ago to intercept and record all communications directed at my old corporate email and disconnected phone numbers. I clicked the icon opening a secure audio file dashboard. My inbox was overflowing with voicemails. There were dozens of them, all marked with urgent red priority tags. They were entirely from Yvonne. I clicked play on the first audio file, leaning back in my chair. "Kendra, pick up the phone right now," Yvonne commanded, her voice echoing through my laptop speakers with its usual abrasive authority. "This childish disappearing act is completely unacceptable. Jamal is in serious trouble, and we need your signature on the bank documents immediately. Call me the second you get this message." I smiled, tapping the spacebar to skip to the next file. The timestamp showed it had been left only 20 minutes after the first. "Kendra, this is not a game." Yvonne's voice had lost its commanding edge, replaced by a frantic, breathless panic. "The bank rejected the bridge loan because you are not here. Apex Holdings is threatening to foreclose on our house. The house, Kendra. They are going to take the house. You need to come back and fix this right now. You cannot just leave us like this." I let the files play sequentially, listening to the rapid deterioration of my mother's psychological state. With each passing hour, her voicemails grew increasingly unhinged. The arrogant matriarch who had proudly declared me a failure at every family holiday was completely crumbling under the weight of her own financial ruin. She was begging, demanding, and sobbing into the receiver, all within the span of a single 3-minute recording. Then came the final voicemail, left just moments before Jamal received his mandatory summons. "If we lose this house, it is entirely your fault," Yvonne shrieked, her voice cracking into a ragged, hysterical sob. "You are doing this on purpose. You are punishing us because you have always been jealous of your brother. You abandoned your own blood when we needed you the most. You need to come back here and pay off this ruthless landlord before they destroy our lives. You owe us, Kendra. You owe your family. I reached out and gently closed the audio application, the silence of the beach immediately washing back over me. I looked out at the rolling blue waves, letting my mother's vicious words sink in. She was right about one thing. They were being destroyed by a ruthless landlord. What Yvonne, Calvin, and Jamal did not know, what they had been entirely too arrogant and intellectually lazy to figure out, was the true identity behind Apex Holdings. 2 years ago, when I first realized the absolute depth of Jamal's financial parasitism and the catastrophic danger of the collateral clause my parents had signed, I began quietly shifting my massive corporate bonuses into a blind trust. I used that trust to legally incorporate Apex Holdings, structuring it through a labyrinth of privacy laws and proxy directors to ensure my name never appeared on any public registry. When the commercial plaza housing Jamal's luxury fitness club went into receivership following the previous owner's bankruptcy, I struck. Apex Holdings purchased the entire property outright for a fraction of its market value. When Jamal's lease came up for renewal, the property management firm sent him the new contract bearing the Apex logo. Jamal was so obsessed with his own reflection and his social media presence that he never bothered to have a lawyer review the paperwork. He never looked up the new ownership board. He simply signed on the dotted line, blindly agreeing to the strict default clauses and severe financial penalties I had personally drafted. For 18 months, Jamal had been paying his exorbitant monthly rent directly into my corporate accounts. And when he stopped paying, deciding his money was better spent on designer clothes and leased sports cars, he handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to initiate the foreclosure on my parents' house. I was not just ignoring their crisis, I was the architect of it. I was the phantom CEO of Apex Holdings, and I held the deed to their absolute ruin in the palm of my hand. My laptop chimed again, pulling me away from the satisfying irony of my mother's voicemails. It was another secure message from Tara, but this time the subject line was different. It did not contain an update on the property management firm or a report from Marcus the concierge. The subject line simply read, "You are going to want to see this immediately." I opened the encrypted email. Tara had forwarded me a high-resolution screenshot sent to her by a mutual acquaintance back in the city. The acquaintance was a high society event planner who frequently organized the lavish charity galas that Chelsea Jamal's status-obsessed wife attended simply to be photographed. I clicked on the image, expanding it across my screen. It was an email drafted directly from Chelsea's personal account. Chelsea had completely cracked under the pressure of the impending bankruptcy. The facade of the wealthy, supportive wife had shattered the second she realized the limitless credit cards were declining and the luxury gym was being padlocked. In a state of blind, manic terror, she had typed out a frantic, desperate plea for a cash bailout. The email was explicitly intended for her own affluent country club parents living in an exclusive gated community in Connecticut. But in her hysterical panic, her perfectly manicured fingers had slipped. Instead of sending the message to her mother, Chelsea had accidentally hit reply, all on an old email thread regarding a charity luncheon, sending her venomous, unhinged confession directly to the event planner, who was fiercely loyal to Tara. I leaned closer to the screen, reading the words Chelsea had frantically typed. "Mom and Dad, you have to wire me the money immediately." Chelsea wrote, her grammar deteriorating with every sentence. "Jamal is completely broke. His ridiculous gym is being liquidated and his trashy parents are losing their suburban house. It is a complete disaster. I cannot be tied to this sinking ship. They are dragging me down with them." His sister finally snapped and vanished, leaving them with absolutely nothing, because they are all financial parasites who lived off her salary. "Send the funds to my private account today so I can hire a lawyer and file for divorce before their massive bankruptcy hits my pristine credit score. I am leaving him tonight." I read the email a second time, letting a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. Chelsea did not love Jamal. She loved the shadow money I provided. She loved the illusion of wealth, and the moment that illusion was violently ripped away, she was ready to abandon him without a second thought. She viewed his family with absolute disgust, regarding them as nothing more than trashy parasites who had outlived their usefulness. This intercepted email was the ultimate weapon. Jamal derived his entire sense of self-worth from his beautiful trophy wife and his fake luxury lifestyle. He truly believed Chelsea worshipped the ground he walked on. He believed he was an untouchable king. I tapped my fingers against the glass table, watching the seagulls dive toward the ocean surface. The mandatory mediation meeting was set for 14 days from now. My parents and Jamal would be forced to sit in a sterile corporate boardroom completely unprotected, waiting for the ruthless CEO of Apex Holdings to walk through the doors and decide their fate. They were expecting a faceless corporate shark. They were expecting a stranger they could manipulate, beg, or charm. I reached for my laptop and typed a quick response to Tara. "Print this email on high-quality cardstock," I wrote. "Place it inside a sealed black folder. Bring it to the mediation boardroom. We are going to hand Jamal his divorce papers right before I take his gym." I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, the bright light cutting through the soft shadows of my beachfront living room. The ocean breeze fluttered the sheer curtains, but the air inside my chest felt entirely still. I was reading a masterclass in narcissistic self-preservation. Chelsea had typed the email in a state of absolute manic terror, and every single word exposed the hollow, rotting core of her marriage to my brother. I read her frantic sentences detailing exactly how she viewed the family she had married into. "Mom and Dad, you need to initiate the wire transfer to my private account today," Chelsea wrote, her panic bleeding through the screen. Jamal is a complete fraud. His entire luxury lifestyle was a house of cards funded by his sister, and now that she has vanished, the money is completely gone. His gym is being liquidated by a ruthless corporate landlord, and his parents are about to lose their house because they were stupid enough to put it up as collateral. I am not going down with them. Calvin and Yvonne are financially illiterate leeches who have lived beyond their means for decades. I cannot subject the children to this level of public humiliation and poverty. I am transferring the remaining funds from our joint checking account tomorrow morning. I am packing up the kids and driving to your estate in Connecticut before the weekend. Have your legal team draft the divorce papers immediately. I need to sever myself from Jamal before his massive bankruptcy destroys my pristine credit score. Do not reply to this email, just send the wire. I sat back in my plush chair, the soft cashmere of my robe wrapping around me like a shield. I read the email a second time, letting the sheer venom of Chelsea's words wash over me. For years, Chelsea had paraded around family gatherings, looking down her perfectly sculpted nose at me. She had mocked my practical clothes, my long hours at the office, and my lack of a husband. She had proudly worn the designer jewelry bought with my shadow money while treating me like the hired help. She had fully participated in my family's delusion that Jamal was a brilliant self-made entrepreneur. Now the illusion was violently shattered and the rats were scrambling to abandon the sinking ship. A tiny fleeting voice in the back of my mind, the voice of the old obedient Kendra, whispered that I should warn my parents. I should forward the email to Calvin and Yvonne to brace them for the ultimate humiliation of losing their golden daughter-in-law. If Chelsea drained the remaining joint accounts, Jamal would not even have grocery money. He would be left entirely destitute, relying on parents who were days away from foreclosure. I picked up my mug of chamomile tea and took a slow, deliberate sip. The warm liquid felt soothing against my throat. I pictured my hospital room. I remembered waking up to the sterile beep of the heart monitor, the agonizing pain radiating from my abdomen, and the absolute crushing realization that no one was coming to hold my hand. They had chosen a recreational basketball game over my survival. They had chosen their own comfort over my life. I set the mug down and tapped the trackpad on my laptop. I did not forward the email to my parents. I did not send a warning text to my brother. I opened a secure channel to Tara and typed my final directive for the evening. Print this exact email on high-quality cardstock. Place it inside a sealed black presentation folder. Bring it to the mediation boardroom tomorrow. We are going to hand Jamal his divorce papers right before I take his gym. I closed the laptop, shutting off the bright screen. I walked out onto the balcony, breathing in the salty night air, feeling a profound, icy peace settling over my soul. The execution was set, hundreds of miles away. The atmosphere inside the mahogany-paneled office of Richard Sterling was thick with the suffocating stench of panic. Richard had been the Adams family attorney for over a decade, handling their minor legal disputes and reviewing their simple contracts. He sat behind his massive oak desk, staring at the thick stack of documents Apex Holdings had delivered by courier that morning. Jamal paced relentlessly across the Persian rug, running his hands over his perfectly faded haircut. He wore a tailored suit, a desperate attempt to project the image of a successful businessman, but his bloodshot eyes and erratic movements betrayed him. Calvin sat rigidly in a leather guest chair, his face a sickly shade of gray. Yvonne sat next to him, shredding a tissue between her manicured fingers. Chelsea sat perfectly still in the corner, playing the role of the devoted, terrified wife, while secretly texting her mother under the edge of her designer handbag. "Tell me we have a case," Richard Jamal demanded, stopping his pacing to slam his hands flat on the desk. "Tell me we can file an injunction. We can tie this up in commercial court for months, right? They cannot just change the locks and sell my equipment in 14 days. I have tenant rights." Richard slowly removed his reading glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. He looked at Jamal with a mixture of professional pity and profound exasperation. "You do not have a case, Jamal." Richard stated, his voice heavy and flat. "You do not have tenant rights because you severely violated every single stipulation of this commercial lease." "That is impossible," Calvin interjected, his voice shaking. "We have dealt with commercial landlords before. There is a standard 30-day grace period. There is an eviction process. They have to file through the county clerk." Richard picked up the Apex Holdings contract and turned it around, sliding it across the desk toward Calvin. "This is not a standard lease, Calvin. This is the most aggressive, ironclad, predatory commercial contract I have seen in my entire career. Whoever drafted this document anticipated your exact pattern of default. When Apex Holdings bought the plaza, they initiated a high-risk tenant protocol. Jamal, you signed a waiver waiving your right to a standard eviction process. You agreed to a specialized arbitration clause that grants the landlord the immediate right to seize and liquidate all assets on the premises. The second an account falls 90 days into arrears. But the money is coming," Jamal shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I just need a few more days to track down Kendra. Once she signs the bank forms, I can pay the entire balance in full." "She is not answering her phone." Jamal Yvonne sobbed loudly, pressing the shredded tissue to her face. "She is gone. She abandoned us. We cannot find her anywhere." Richard raised his hand, calling for silence in his office. "Tracking down your daughter is entirely irrelevant at this point," he said, looking directly at Calvin. "Apex Holdings is no longer waiting for back rent. They have accelerated the contract. They are demanding the full payout of the broken lease, the late penalties, and the liquidation fees." "How much?" Chelsea asked, speaking for the first time, her voice tight and calculated. $150,000, Richard answered, tapping the foreclosure notice resting on top of the file. "And because Jamal has zero liquid assets and zero commercial credit, they are executing the personal guarantees." Calvin gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly the leather groaned. "They are taking our house. They are initiating the process today," Richard confirmed, his tone completely devoid of comfort. "You signed the personal guarantee, Calvin. You leveraged your residential property against Jamal's commercial venture. Apex Holdings has the legal right to place a lien on your home and force a public auction to satisfy the debt." "We will fight it," Yvonne shrieked, slamming her hand on her knee. "We will hire a litigation team. We will drag them through court until they back down. We are not losing our home because of some faceless corporate bully." "You do not have the capital to fight this, Yvonne," Richard said bluntly, stripping away the last remaining shred of their delusion. "You are facing a multi-billion-dollar holding company. They have teams of corporate assassins who do nothing but litigate breached contracts. They will bleed you entirely dry in legal fees before you ever see the inside of a courtroom. If you try to fight this, you will not just lose the house. You will be forced into total bankruptcy. Your retirement accounts, your vehicles, your remaining assets will all be seized to pay the legal judgments." The room fell into a horrifying, dead silence. The reality of their total annihilation finally pierced through their generational arrogance. Jamal sank into the empty chair next to his father, burying his face in his hands. The empire he had pretended to build was crushing his family to death. "So what do we do?" Calvin asked, his voice barely a whisper, sounding like an old defeated man. Richard picked up the final sheet of paper, the mandatory mediation summons from the Phantom CEO. He slid it across the desk, positioning it perfectly between Jamal and Calvin. "You do exactly what this document commands," Richard instructed. "You go to the Apex Holdings corporate headquarters tomorrow morning. You walk into that boardroom, and you do not argue. You do not negotiate. You do not demand tenant rights. You throw yourselves on the mercy of whoever runs this company. You beg this CEO for an extension, a payment plan, or a settlement. And if they say no," Jamal asked, looking up with hollow, terrified eyes. "If they say no," Richard replied, leaning back in his chair, the heavy mahogany clock ticking rhythmically against the wall. "Then the auction proceeds. The gym is liquidated, and your parents hand over the keys to their house." The glass elevator shot up 40 stories into the city skyline, carrying a silence so heavy it threatened to snap the steel cables holding them aloft. Calvin, Yvonne, Jamal, and Chelsea stood shoulder to shoulder in the confined space, yet they had never been further apart. The sheer terror of their impending financial execution had stripped away every ounce of their generational arrogance, leaving behind only raw, unadulterated desperation. They were marching toward a firing squad, and every single one of them knew it. Calvin wore his absolute best navy-tailored suit, though it suddenly looked a full size too big on his shrinking frame. He kept adjusting his silk tie, his hands shaking with a violent tremor he could not hide. Yvonne had painted on her most intimidating crimson lipstick and draped herself in her signature pearls, desperately trying to project the image of an untouchable suburban matriarch. But the dark circles under her eyes and the frantic darting of her gaze betrayed the absolute panic consuming her. She clutched her luxury handbag against her chest, as if it could somehow deflect the financial ruin barreling toward them. Jamal was sweating through his custom Italian dress shirt, the expensive fabric sticking to his back like a second skin. He kept checking his gold watch, the one he had bought using the shadow money I provided, swallowing hard against the nausea rising in his throat. His entire identity was tied to the gym that had just been padlocked, and the reality of facing a public auction was destroying his fragile ego. Beside him, Chelsea stood unnaturally still. She was dressed impeccably, holding her designer handbag like a protective shield, but her eyes were completely cold and calculating. She was entirely detached from the terrified family surrounding her. She knew exactly what she was going to do the moment this meeting concluded. She was merely playing her part, waiting for the axe to fall on Jamal, so she could execute the exit strategy she had outlined in her intercepted email. She was going to drain their remaining accounts, take the children, and leave my parents holding the bag for her husband's complete failure. The elevator doors parted with a soft chime, revealing the sprawling, intimidating fortress of Apex Holdings. The reception area was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Cold slate floors, towering walls of tinted frosted glass, and absolute unforgiving silence greeted them. A receptionist with a sharp gaze and a discreet earpiece nodded at them, motioning toward the massive frosted double doors at the far end of the corridor. "The boardroom has been prepared for you," the receptionist said, her voice completely devoid of any customer service warmth. "Please take your seats. The chief executive officer will join you shortly." They walked into a room designed specifically for domination. The mahogany table was massive, stretching 20 feet across the center of the room, polished to a flawless mirror shine. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, vertigo-inducing view of the city below, making anyone who stood near them feel incredibly small. There was no coffee station. There was no water pitcher. There was absolutely nothing offered to make them comfortable. The room was freezing, the air conditioning turned down to a chilling temperature that made Yvonne shiver immediately. Calvin took a seat near the middle of the table, pulling out a stack of disorganized financial papers from his leather briefcase. Jamal slumped into the chair next to him, bouncing his knee rapidly against the table leg. Yvonne sat rigidly across from them, staring at the massive, empty leather chair positioned at the head of the table. The chair belonging to the Phantom CEO who held the deed to her home. They waited. 5 minutes turned into 10. 10 minutes stretched into 20. The deliberate psychological torture of the silence began to break them down piece by piece. "This is completely ridiculous," Yvonne hissed, breaking the quiet. "Who do they think they are keeping us waiting like this? We are respected members of the community. Calvin, you need to demand some respect when this person walks in. You need to remind them who they are dealing with." Calvin dragged a shaking hand across his face. "We are not in a position to demand anything, Yvonne." He snapped, his voice carrying a harsh, raspy edge. "We are here to beg. We are going to sit here, shut our mouths, and pray they agree to a payment plan. If you insult this person, we lose the house today." Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. "I can talk to them," Jamal muttered, his voice lacking its usual magnetic confidence. "I just need to explain the gym's projected revenue. Once they see my business plan, they will understand the cash flow is coming. I just need a 90-day extension." Chelsea rolled her eyes, staring out the window. "You do not have a business plan, Jamal," she said, her tone dripping with quiet venom. "You have a locked door and a seized inventory. Just let Calvin do the talking before you make us look even more pathetic." Jamal opened his mouth to launch into a defensive rage, but the heavy brass handles of the double doors turned with a loud mechanical click. The entire family froze their breath, catching in their throats. They sat up straight, bracing themselves to face the ruthless corporate entity that had orchestrated their total ruin. The doors swung wide open. Two high-powered corporate attorneys entered the boardroom first. They were impeccably dressed in dark, bespoke suits, carrying thick leather portfolios. They moved with predatory grace, separating to stand on either side of the massive leather chair at the head of the table. Then I walked into the room. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer with razor-sharp lapels and a crisp silk blouse. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless twist, and my heels clicked against the slate floor with rhythmic, absolute authority. I did not look like the exhausted, obedient daughter they had abandoned in a hospital bed. I looked like an executioner. I walked past my family, completely ignoring their stunned, gasping faces. I approached the head of the table, stopping just behind the heavy leather chair. The two attorneys stood silently behind me, flanking me like armed guards ready to deploy on my command. For a full 10 seconds, the boardroom was trapped in a state of suspended animation. My parents and my brother stared at me as if I were an apparition. The color drained entirely from Jamal's face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. Yvonne's jaw hung slack, her painted red lips parted in absolute shock. Chelsea gripped her handbag, her calculating eyes darting between my tailored suit and the imposing attorneys standing at my shoulders. Calvin was the first to break the silence, his mind desperately scrambling to make sense of the visual information in front of him, automatically defaulted to his usual narrative. He assumed I was still the safety net. He assumed I had somehow gotten a job at this holding company and had come to save them from their own stupidity. "You," Calvin stammered, pushing his chair back slightly, his voice cracking under the weight of his utter confusion. "You work for Apex." He looked from me to the two intimidating attorneys, a confused, hopeful smile twitching at the corners of his mouth. He actually believed I was there to intervene on his behalf. I smiled coldly, maintaining unbreakable eye contact with the man who had treated me like a disposable asset my entire life. I reached down and seamlessly slid my sleek leather briefcase onto the polished mahogany table, letting the heavy thud echo through the silent room. "I do not work for Apex." "Dad," I said, my voice ringing out with absolute crystal-clear finality. "I am Apex. I own the plaza. I own Jamal's debt. And as of yesterday, I hold the lien on your house." The echo of my declaration hung in the freezing air of the boardroom for exactly 3 seconds before the entire room violently erupted. Yvonne leaped from her leather chair with such explosive force that it tipped backward, crashing into the base of the floor-to-ceiling window. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, her perfectly maintained suburban facade instantly dissolving into sheer hysteria. "You absolute monster!" Yvonne screamed, the sound tearing through the sterile corporate silence like a siren. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes wide with a manic, frantic energy. "You set us up. You orchestrated this entire psychotic scheme to trap your own flesh and blood. You bought that plaza specifically to ruin us. You are deliberately destroying your brother's life out of petty, pathetic jealousy, all because we missed a single hospital visit." Her voice echoed off the frosted glass walls, shrill and completely devoid of any accountability. She was frantically attempting to rewrite reality, desperately clinging to the delusion that she was the victim of a vindictive spinster rather than the architect of her own financial demise. "You are punishing your family over a minor scheduling conflict." Yvonne continued, her chest heaving as she gripped the edge of the table. "People have routine surgery every single day, Kendra. You are trying to steal our home and ruin Jamal's legacy because of your own fragile ego." I did not blink. I did not shift in my chair. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. The two corporate attorneys standing behind me remained as still as statues, their expressions carved from granite. The stark contrast between Yvonne's erratic screaming and my absolute glacial silence seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the room. I calmly reached into my sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. I unclasped the metal fastener and withdrew a stack of official hospital records. The top page was stamped with stark red confidentiality warnings and bold triage codes. With a smooth, deliberate motion, I slid the thick file across the polished mahogany table directly into the center where Calvin, Yvonne, and Jamal were forced to look at it. "That is my intensive care medical chart," I stated, my voice cutting through Yvonne's hysterical ranting like a blade of ice. "I want you to look very closely at page 4. I want you to read the clinical definition of your minor scheduling conflict." Calvin leaned forward, his hands trembling violently as he stared at the bold medical terminology printed on the page. His eyes darted across the terrifying blocks of text. I did not have a routine procedure. I continued, forcing them to hear every single brutal detail. My body went into severe septic shock. My organs began shutting down one by one. I required emergency invasive surgery to stop massive internal hemorrhaging. I was cut open on a steel table and pumped full of 6 units of donor blood just to keep my brain functioning. I was fighting a catastrophic systemic infection while you were sipping champagne. Yvonne's mouth clamped shut, her face draining of its furious color, but her eyes remained defiant, refusing to accept the reality of her neglect. She crossed her arms over her chest, physically shielding herself from the truth sitting on the table. "I want you to look at the timestamp on the bottom of the trauma report," I instructed, my gaze locking onto Jamal, who was staring at the medical file as if it were a venomous snake. "It says 2:14 in the afternoon. Do you know what happened at exactly 2:14 in the afternoon, Jamal?" My medical team called a code blue. I flatlined. My heart completely stopped beating. A team of trauma surgeons had to hit my chest with a defibrillator to shock me back to life. I died on that table. The boardroom was entirely silent now, save for the ragged, shallow breathing of my father. Richard Sterling, the family attorney, looked away entirely, unable to meet my eyes. Professional disgust radiating from his rigid posture. He had clearly not been informed of the medical reality surrounding my estrangement, and the revelation was making him physically uncomfortable. He knew that every signature on those commercial lease documents was legally binding, and he was realizing his clients were facing an emotional execution as well as a financial one. I reached back into the manila envelope and pulled out a single glossy sheet of photo paper. It was a high-resolution printed screenshot of a text message thread obtained legally through the server intercepts I had running on my old devices. I slid it precisely across the table, letting it come to rest right beside my cardiac arrest report. "This is a text message Chelsea sent to her personal trainer," I said, shifting my cold gaze to my sister-in-law, who was now pressing herself deep into the corner of the room. "Look at the timestamp." Calvin's shaking fingers reached out and pulled the photograph closer. He stared at the glowing green text bubble. The timestamp printed at the top of the message read 2:14 in the afternoon. "Read it out loud." "Dad," I commanded, leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "Read the exact words your daughter-in-law typed," while my heart was stopped. Calvin swallowed hard, his voice cracking into a pathetic rasp. as he read the message to the silent room. The valet at this stupid charity luncheon is a complete joke. They are making us park 3 blocks away, and I am furious because my new Louboutins are going to be completely ruined by the time I reach the red carpet. Remind me to make Jamal fire whoever organized this disaster. I let the sheer shallow vanity of those words hang in the freezing air of the boardroom. The words echoed off the walls, painting a vivid, grotesque picture of the people sitting across from me. My heart stopped beating in a sterile trauma bay. I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet whisper that commanded absolute attention. My chest was being cracked open to save my life. And at that exact identical second, your wife Jamal was complaining about scratching her designer shoes at a networking luncheon. Jamal slowly turned his head to look at Chelsea, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and desperate denial. Chelsea had not moved a single muscle to comfort her husband. She sat with her posture rigid, her eyes calculating the precise moment she would execute her own escape. The revelation of my medical trauma did not move her, and the impending loss of my parents' house did not concern her. The only thing she cared about was the fact that the shadow money was gone and her luxury lifestyle had instantly evaporated. She refused to make eye contact with him, staring rigidly at the polished surface of the table, her jaw clenched tight. Her mask of the supportive, terrified wife was slipping, revealing the cold, calculating opportunist hiding underneath. "You cannot possibly blame us for that!" Yvonne suddenly interjected, her voice rising again, desperate to regain control of the narrative. "We did not know the severity of the situation, Kendra. Nobody called us. The surgical staff did not update us. We thought you were fine. You cannot use a medical emergency as an excuse to steal our property and ruin your brother. We are your family. We are supposed to protect each other." "You are not my family," I replied instantly, shutting down her manufactured outrage. "You are a collection of financial parasites who have spent 35 years feeding off my bank accounts, my credit score, and my professional reputation. You have used me as a human shield to protect Jamal from the consequences of his own spectacular incompetence." "I am not incompetent!" Jamal suddenly shouted, his fragile ego finally snapping under the crushing pressure of my words. He slammed his fist against the table, rattling the medical files. "I built that fitness club from the ground up. I created a luxury brand that people respect. You are just a bitter corporate drone who is trying to steal my empire because you could never build one of your own." I let out a short, harsh laugh that echoed loudly through the large room. The sound made Jamal flinch, physically shrinking back into his chair as he realized his outburst held absolutely zero power in this room. "You do not have an empire, Jamal," I stated, laying out the absolute unvarnished truth. "You have a leased room full of leased equipment funded by a credit line that I personally guaranteed. You do not have a business plan. You do not have cash flow. You do not even understand how to read a basic profit and loss statement. The only reason your doors stayed open for the past 18 months is because I was silently funneling my corporate bonuses into your operating account just to keep the lights on. You are a fraud." Calvin looked at Jamal, his eyes widening in horror as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Calvin reached up and loosened his silk tie, struggling to pull air into his lungs. The reality of his impending homelessness was finally overriding his lifelong habit of defending Jamal. He looked around the sleek, imposing boardroom, realizing that the safety net he had relied on for 3 decades had transformed into a steel cage. "Is that true, Jamal?" Calvin demanded, his voice shaking with a new kind of terror. "Have you been taking her money to run the club? Have you been operating at a loss this entire time?" Jamal opened his mouth to deny it, to spin another web of arrogant lies, but the crushing weight of the evidence sitting on the table silenced him. He looked down at his lap, his silence providing all the confirmation Calvin needed. The Golden Sun was finally exposed as a complete failure. "When I realized the absolute depth of your financial delusions, I continued addressing my father directly. And the fact that you, Calvin, were foolish enough to sign a personal guarantee leveraging your own home to fund this disaster, I knew exactly how this was going to end. I knew Jamal was going to crash this company into a brick wall, and I knew he was going to take you down with him. I simply stepped out of the way and let gravity do its job. Yvonne crossed her arms over her chest, her face twisting into a vicious sneer. So, you admit it. You admit you plotted to steal our house. You are sitting there gloating about ruining your own parents. You engineered this entire foreclosure to punish us for missing a hospital visit. You trapped us, Kendra. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany table, my eyes locking onto Yvonne's furious face. The time for indulging their delusions was officially over. I was going to strip away every single layer of their manufactured victimhood. I didn't trap you, I state firmly. You leveraged your own home for a man who hasn't paid his bills in months. I'm just here to collect. Jamal turns to Chelsea, desperate for her to defend him. Jamal turned his body entirely away from me, his eyes wide and frantic as he desperately sought refuge in the only person he believed was still safely in his corner. He lunged across the armrest and grabbed Chelsea by the wrist, his sweaty fingers digging into her expensive silk blouse. "Tell them, Chelsea!" He pleaded, his voice a pathetic high-pitched whine that echoed off the frosted glass walls of the boardroom. "Tell my father. Tell this arrogant bitch that she is completely wrong. Tell them how hard I work. Tell them about the late nights at the club. Tell them about the networking events and the aggressive expansion plans we discussed. Tell them my business is just going through a temporary rough patch." Chelsea froze. Her entire body went rigid under his grasp. She stared at Jamal as if he were a rotting corpse that had suddenly grabbed her arm. She tried to pull her wrist away, her perfect porcelain mask, slipping to reveal the sheer trapped panic underneath. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She glanced nervously toward the heavy double doors, her survival instinct screaming at her to flee the room before the collateral damage splashed onto her designer shoes. I did not give her the chance to formulate a lie. I reached to my right without breaking eye contact with my brother. My lead attorney immediately stepped forward and placed a sleek black presentation folder directly into my outstretched hand. The matte leather felt cool and substantial against my skin. I placed my palm flat against the cover and pushed it across the mirror shine of the mahogany table. It glided with a quiet hum, stopping precisely inches from Jamal's tightly clenched fists. "I think Chelsea has already expressed her thoughts on your business acumen, Jamal," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth conversational tone that cut through the tension like a razor. "But since she seems to have lost her voice, I brought a hard copy." Jamal stared at the black folder as if it contained a live explosive. He slowly released Chelsea's wrist and reached out with a trembling hand, flipping the heavy cover open. Resting inside on premium high-quality cardstock was the intercepted email. I watched the exact moment his fragile manufactured reality completely shattered. His eyes tracked across the first line, and his breathing instantly stopped. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. The paper began to shake violently in his hands, rattling against the polished wood of the table. "What is this?" Jamal whispered, the sound barely making it past his lips. His eyes darted back and forth across the page, absorbing the venomous words his beloved wife had typed while he was facing absolute ruin. "Read it out loud." "Jamal," I commanded, leaning back in my leather chair and crossing my arms. "Read the exact words your devoted, supportive wife sent to her parents yesterday afternoon. Read what she really thinks of your empire." Jamal swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing a line down his temple. He opened his mouth, but his voice failed him. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer brutality of the betrayal. Calvin, having recovered from his initial shock, reached over and snatched the heavy cardstock directly out of his son's hands. Calvin adjusted his posture, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the text. I watched my father's expression morph from confusion to absolute unadulterated horror. "Financially illiterate leeches." Calvin read aloud, his voice shaking with a dangerous, terrible fury. He looked up, glaring directly at Chelsea. "You called us financially illiterate leeches." Chelsea shrank back into her chair, pressing herself against the mahogany paneling. Calvin looked back down at the paper, his face turning a deep shade of crimson as he read the rest of her frantic escape plan. "I cannot be tied to this sinking ship." Calvin read, his volume rising with every single syllable. I am preparing to file for divorce before their massive bankruptcy hits my pristine credit score. I am draining the remaining joint accounts tomorrow morning and taking the kids to Connecticut. Yvonne let out a sound that was half gasp and half shriek. She lunged forward across the table, her manicured hands curling into claws. The family unit that had prided itself on presenting a united, flawless front to the world was instantly detonating. They were cannibalizing each other right in front of my eyes. "You parasitic little gold digger!" Yvonne screamed, spit flying from her lips as she pointed a shaking finger at Chelsea's face. "We welcomed you into this family. We paid for your ridiculous wedding. We mortgaged our own home to fund your husband's business so you could parade around the city pretending to be royalty. And the second things get difficult, you plan to steal my grandchildren and drain my son's bank accounts. You are an absolute monster." Chelsea realized she was completely cornered. The sweet, supportive facade she had worn for years melted away in a fraction of a second, exposing the ruthless, calculating opportunist hiding underneath. She stopped, shrinking back into her chair. She sat up straight, squaring her shoulders and glaring back at Yvonne with pure, unfiltered disgust. "Do not you dare play the victim with me, Yvonne." Chelsea snapped, her voice sharp and ringing with absolute contempt. "You are all pathetic. You spent decades funding a grown man's delusions because you were too cowardly to admit he is completely useless. He is a fraud. This entire family is a fraud. You leased luxury cars you could not afford and threw parties to impress people who secretly laugh at you. I am not going down with your pathetic sinking ship. I have my own life to protect." Jamal sat frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the wall. The woman he worshipped, the woman who validated his entire existence, had just verbally eviscerated him in front of the sister he had spent his life tormenting. His jaw trembled, but he remained entirely silent, broken beyond repair. "You are not taking a single dime from my son," Calvin roared, slamming his fist against the table. "I will have lawyers freeze those accounts before you can even leave this building. You are going to walk out of this marriage with exactly what you brought into it, which is absolutely nothing." Chelsea let out a harsh, mocking laugh, standing up so quickly her heavy leather chair tipped backward and crashed onto the slate floor. "Your son does not have a single dime to take, Calvin," Chelsea sneered, grabbing her designer handbag from the floor. "His accounts are overdrawn. His credit is destroyed. He is facing a $150,000 corporate lawsuit, and you are about to be homeless. You have absolutely nothing left to threaten me with. I am leaving. I am filing the paperwork today, and I never want to see any of your miserable faces ever again." Chelsea spun on her heel, her expensive stilettos cracking sharply against the stone floor as she bolted toward the exit. She reached for the heavy brass handles of the double doors, her eyes wide with the desperate need to escape the suffocating reality of the boardroom. She did not make it. I gave a fractional nod to my left. Vance, my lead corporate attorney, moved with a sudden, terrifying speed. He stepped effortlessly in front of the heavy wooden doors, his broad shoulders entirely blocking her exit. He did not say a word. He simply crossed his arms and stared down at her, his expression completely impassive. Chelsea gasped, taking a hurried step backward. She turned around, her eyes darting frantically from Vance to me. "Move!" she demanded, her voice trembling with rising panic. "You cannot keep me in here. This is illegal. I am leaving." I reached out and slowly tapped my manicured fingernail against the polished mahogany table. The sharp, rhythmic sound echoed through the silent room, instantly drawing every single eye back to me. "We aren't finished," I stated, my voice radiating a dark, heavy authority that anchored them all to their seats. "You don't get to run away, Chelsea. You are legally married to the primary leaseholder, and your signature is on the secondary guarantor documents for the commercial loan. You are just as liable for this catastrophic mess as the rest of them." I stood up slowly, buttoning the center button of my tailored blazer. I looked down at Jamal, who was still staring at the empty space where his wife had been sitting. I looked at Calvin, whose chest was heaving with exertion, and at Yvonne, who was openly weeping into her hands. "You owe me $150,000 in back rent, Jamal." I said, the finality of the statement hanging in the air like a guillotine blade, "and I am collecting it today." Jamal stared at me, his jaw working soundlessly as his brain violently rejected the absolute reality of my words. He looked down at the polished mahogany table and then back up at my impassive face. The air in the boardroom had grown so thick with tension it felt practically toxic. "I do not have $150,000, Kendra Jamal said, his voice lacking any of its usual arrogant bass. It was a thin, reedy sound. "You know I do not have it. The accounts are completely frozen. You shut down my credit lines. You locked me out of my own building. How am I supposed to hand you a check today?" "That sounds like a spectacular personal failure, Jamal," I replied, my tone completely conversational as I took my seat at the head of the table. "But the liquidity of your assets is certainly not a corporate concern of Apex Holdings. You signed a binding commercial lease. You failed to remit payment for 3 consecutive quarters. The debt is due." Chelsea practically threw herself against the heavy wooden doors, her manicured hands scrambling uselessly against the solid brass handles. "Let me out of here!" she shrieked, turning her terrified gaze toward Vance, who remained planted in front of the exit like a stone gargoyle. "I am not a part of this business. I am filing for divorce. You cannot hold me hostage for his debts." Vance did not flinch. He simply looked at me, waiting for a directive. "You are entirely free to leave Chelsea the moment we conclude our business," I stated, steepling my fingers on the desk. "But as I just reminded you, your elegant signature is printed clearly on the secondary guarantor documents. You enjoyed the luxury cars, the exotic vacations, and the country club memberships funded by this business. You gladly spent the profits, so you are now legally bound to the deficits. You owe Apex Holdings $150,000, just as much as your soon-to-be ex-husband does." Chelsea let out a breathless sob, sliding her back down the frosted glass wall, until she collapsed onto the floor, her designer handbag spilling its contents onto the slate tiles. I turned my attention away from the pathetic display on the floor and locked my eyes onto my parents. Calvin and Yvonne were clutching each other, their faces completely devoid of color. The realization that their golden son was completely destitute and taking them down with him had finally shattered their lifelong delusion. "Which brings us to the collateral," I said, tapping my manicured index finger against the thick file resting in front of me. "Because the primary leaseholder and the secondary guarantor lack the capital to satisfy the debt, the burden automatically falls to the property leveraged in the contract." "You cannot take our home!" Yvonne cried out, tears streaking her heavy makeup. "Kendra, please, you are our daughter. You grew up in that house. You cannot throw your own mother and father onto the street. We will find a way to pay you back. We will get second jobs. We will sell the cars. Just give us time." I looked at the woman who had spent 35 years telling me I was a disappointment. I looked at the mother who had deliberately skipped visiting me in the intensive care unit because she felt a country club luncheon was a more pressing priority. "You do not have time, Yvonne," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial whisper. "And you certainly do not have the earning potential to generate $150,000 before the foreclosure auction proceeds next week. Your house is gone. Your retirement is gone. Your entire curated suburban existence is completely over." Calvin let out a ragged, wheezing breath, gripping his chest. He looked at Jamal with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound terror. "You ruined us," Calvin choked out, his voice shaking with fury. "I trusted you with my assets. I believed in your vision. You told me this fitness club was generating massive profits. You lied to my face for years while you bled your sister dry. I did not want this to happen, Dad," Jamal pleaded, reaching across the table toward his father. "I swear I was going to turn it around. I just needed a little more capital to launch the new marketing campaign. I can fix this. We can fix this together. You just have to trust me one more time." Calvin slapped Jamal's hand away with a vicious, violent motion. "Do not touch me," Calvin snarled. "There is no together anymore. You are a complete fraud." I allowed the beautiful symphony of their mutual destruction to play out for a few more seconds before intervening. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a single pristine blue-bound legal document. I placed it squarely in the center of the table, pushing it deliberately toward Calvin and Yvonne. "There is one alternative," I announced instantly, commanding the attention of every single person in the room. Calvin stopped glaring at Jamal and looked down at the blue folder. He stared at it as if it were a life raft tossed into a freezing ocean. "What is this?" Calvin asked, his voice breathless with desperate hope. It is an ironclad legal ultimatum, I explained, folding my hands neatly on the table. As the sole executive director of Apex Holdings, I possess the unilateral authority to release the lien on your residential property. I can completely forgive the collateral obligation. I can walk away from your house today, leaving your retirement accounts and your suburban lifestyle entirely untouched. Yvonne let out a loud, dramatic gasp of relief, pressing her hands to her chest. Oh, thank God, she wept, looking at me with a sickening display of manufactured maternal affection. I knew you would not destroy us, Kendra. I knew you still loved your family. You are a good daughter. I raised a single finger, silencing her instantly. I will release the lien. I continued, ignoring her pathetic performance. But I will only do it under one non-negotiable condition. I gestured toward the blue folder. Open it, Dad. Read the terms of your survival. Calvin reached out with trembling hands and flipped open the heavy blue cover. He began reading the dense legal text, his eyes tracking rapidly across the page. The further he read, the wider his eyes became. He looked up at me, his mouth falling slightly open in absolute shock. This is a complete severance agreement, Calvin whispered, his voice carrying a note of profound awe. Yes, it is, I confirmed, leaning forward slightly. If you want to keep your house and your comfortable retirement, you will sign that document today. You will legally and irrevocably sever all financial ties to Jamal Adams. You will officially disown his current debt. You will formally renounce any responsibility for his future liabilities. Furthermore, you will sign a binding permanent injunction stating that you will never co-sign a loan offer, collateral, provide housing, or harbor Jamal financially in any capacity for the rest of your natural lives. The boardroom was so quiet, the rhythmic hum of the air conditioning sounded like a jet engine. If you provide Jamal with a single dollar, I stated, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for misinterpretation or negotiation. If you allow him to sleep on your couch, if you buy him a tank of gas, if you violate this severance agreement in any way whatsoever, the lien on your house will be immediately reinstated with maximum compounding penalties, and I will execute the foreclosure within 24 hours. Jamal leaped out of his chair, his face twisting into a mask of pure, feral panic. You cannot do this, Kendra, he screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. You cannot force them to abandon me. I am their son. I am the heir to this family. You are trying to isolate me so you can destroy me completely. I did not even look at him. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my father. You have a choice to make, Calvin, I said, the corners of my mouth turning up into a cold, humorless smile. You can choose your own survival. You can walk out of this building, keep your beautiful home, and continue living your comfortable country club lifestyle. Or you can choose your golden child. You can refuse to sign the document, walk out of here with Jamal, and face total absolute bankruptcy by Friday morning. The choice is yours. Jamal turned to Calvin, dropping to his knees beside his father's leather chair. He gripped Calvin's forearm, his eyes wide with absolute pathetic terror. Dad, please! Jamal begged, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes and tracking down his sweaty cheeks. Please do not do this. You cannot sign that paper. I am your son. I am your boy. We are a team. You said you would always protect me. If you sign that, I have nothing. Chelsea is leaving me. The business is gone. I will be on the street. Please, Dad, I need you. Calvin looked down at the weeping, broken man clutching his arm. He looked at the son he had worshipped for 3 decades, the son he had praised while systematically ignoring my achievements, the son he had allowed to drain my bank accounts and destroy my mental health. Then Calvin looked at the foreclosure notice sitting on the table. He looked at the reality of losing his expensive cars, his sprawling lawn, and the respect of his wealthy neighbors. The struggle lasted less than 5 seconds. Calvin reached across the mahogany table and picked up the heavy gold-plated pen resting next to the severance document. Dad, no! Jamal screamed, his voice cracking into a hysterical shriek. Without a single moment of hesitation, without offering a single word of comfort to his golden child, Calvin gripped the pen and signed his name on the dotted line with quick, brutal, aggressive strokes. He threw his beloved son entirely under the bus, to save his own skin. Jamal released his father's arm, falling backward onto the slate floor. He sat there, surrounded by the ruins of his magnificent delusions, staring at the man who had just legally disowned him. His entire pedestal had crumbled into fine gray dust. Calvin pushed the signed document across the table toward me. He did not look at Jamal. He did not look at Yvonne. He looked directly at me, his eyes dead and empty. "It is done," Calvin said, his voice completely hollow. I picked up the document, inspecting the signature with a profound, deep sense of satisfaction. I nodded to my attorney. Vance reached into his own portfolio and stamped the release of lien, handing the confirmation paper back to Calvin. Yvonne sat, frozen tears streaming silently down her face, entirely unable to comprehend the absolute destruction of her family unit. She looked at Jamal crying on the floor, and then at Calvin, who was already packing his briefcase to leave. She had nothing left to say. I closed my briefcase, snapping the golden lock shut with a sharp, definitive click. I stood up, looking down at the scattered remnants of the Addams family. "You are dismissed," I announced, picking up my bag and turning toward the private executive exit behind my chair. "Oh, and Jamal, you still owe me $150,000. Expect the collection agents at your apartment by noon." Jamal remained motionless on the cold slate floor. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his chest heaving as he stared up at me with eyes that were completely hollowed out. The final remnants of his lifelong arrogance evaporated into the freezing air of the boardroom, leaving behind only raw, unadulterated panic. "I do not have it, Kendra," he whispered, his voice breaking into a pathetic, reedy sound that lacked any of its usual magnetic bass. "I do not have a single dollar left. Chelsea took whatever liquid cash we had sitting in the personal accounts. The business credit lines are maxed out. I am defaulting right here and right now. I have absolutely nothing left to give you." I looked down at him, feeling a profound, deep sense of satisfaction wash over my chest. This was the exact moment I had envisioned while lying in that sterile hospital bed, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical beeping of the heart monitor. The complete and total capitulation of the golden child. I smoothly retrieved my phone from the pocket of my tailored blazer. I unlocked the screen and opened the message thread with my commercial property manager. "Execute the liquidation protocol," I typed. I hit send. Across the city, a fleet of moving trucks was already idling in the sprawling parking lot of Jamal's luxury fitness club. The exact second my text message was delivered, the operation commenced with ruthless efficiency. A team of heavy-duty movers breached the pristine glass doors of his precious gym. They bypassed the sleek reception desk and systematically began dismantling his manufactured empire. The imported Italian leather-weight benches, the rows of state-of-the-art computerized treadmills, the expensive surround sound system, the custom-cut mirrored walls were all unbolted, wrapped, and hauled away. They were stripping the building down to the bare concrete studs to satisfy the back rent. Jamal's entire identity, the physical manifestation of his superiority complex, was being loaded into the back of rented box trucks to be auctioned off to the highest bidder by sunset. Back in the boardroom, Calvin did not even glance backward. He gripped his leather briefcase, his knuckles stark white, and walked out through the heavy brass doors, leaving his ruined son sitting in a heap on the floor. My father had made his choice. He had chosen the house. He had chosen his own comfort over the boy he had worshipped. Yvonne was left standing entirely alone in the center of the massive room. She looked at the closed doors, then down at Jamal, and finally she turned her gaze toward me. Her perfectly painted lips trembled. The realization of what had just transpired crashed over her carefully maintained suburban facade. She had stood by silently and watched her husband legally disown their golden child. The family foundation was obliterated. But Yvonne, ever the opportunistic survivor, possessed an incredible, terrifying ability to rewrite reality to suit her immediate needs. I watched the gears turning in her mind as she frantically sought a new safety net to break her fall. She wiped a single tear from her cheek, her expression morphing from devastation into a grotesque display of maternal vulnerability. "Kendra," Yvonne murmured, taking a tentative step toward me. Her voice was dripping with a sickly sweet manufactured warmth that made my skin crawl. "Oh, Kendra, my brave, smart girl." She took another step, her arms opening slightly as if preparing for an embrace. "You saved us!" Yvonne cried softly, stepping over Jamal's outstretched legs without a second glance. "You exposed Chelsea for the horrible parasitic gold digger she always was. You showed us the truth. We were blinded by Jamal's promises, but you were the only one thinking clearly. We can fix this now. The toxic people are finally gone. We can finally be a real family. You and your father and me. We can start over today." She reached out her manicured hands, aiming for my shoulders, desperately trying to pull me into her twisted delusion. She actually believed I would step into Jamal's vacated spot on the pedestal and fund her lifestyle. I took one deliberate, measured step backward. The physical rejection hit her like a physical blow. Her hands dropped uselessly to her sides, her eyes widening in absolute confusion. I looked at her with unfiltered, glacial indifference. The woman standing in front of me was a complete stranger. She was a hollow shell of vanity and conditional love, and she possessed absolutely no power over me ever again. "I am not your daughter anymore, Yvonne," I stated, my voice echoing off the frosted glass walls with absolute finality. "I am just your landlord." I turned my back on her. Gasping, horrified face walked through the private executive exit and let the heavy door click shut behind me. 6 months later, the morning air was warm and smelled heavily of sea salt. I stood on the expansive wraparound balcony of my beachfront home, holding a ceramic mug of freshly brewed dark roast coffee. The ocean breeze caught the loose waves of my hair, carrying the rhythmic, soothing sound of the crashing tide. I was thriving. The physical scars from my emergency surgery had faded into thin silver lines, and the deep, agonizing emotional wounds inflicted by my family had completely scarred over. My body was strong, my mind was incredibly sharp, and my soul was entirely my own. The commercial plaza that had housed Jamal's catastrophic failure was no longer in my portfolio. 2 months after the brutal boardroom confrontation, a major national real estate developer approached me with a highly aggressive acquisition offer. They wanted to bulldoze the existing structure and build a high-rise luxury condominium complex overlooking the city. I negotiated fiercely, leaning on my corporate expertise to secure a massive multi-million-dollar profit that instantly elevated my personal wealth into an entirely new stratosphere. The lucrative sale provided the capital for this beautiful oceanfront sanctuary, located thousands of miles away from the toxic suburban wasteland of my past. I had traded the suffocating expectations of my family for the boundless horizon of the sea. As for the Addams family, gravity had taken its inevitable merciless toll. Jamal was entirely ruined. The shadow money was gone, the gym was fully liquidated, and Chelsea had executed her exit strategy with ruthless, calculated precision. She filed for divorce the very next morning, dragging him through a brutal, highly publicized legal battle. She leveraged his business failures to secure full custody of their remaining joint assets, leaving Jamal holding the bag for the massive corporate liabilities that I had not seized. The former golden boy, the charismatic entrepreneur who had mocked my work ethic and dismissed my career, was now working a minimum wage retail job selling athletic shoes at a dying suburban mall. He lived in a cramped studio apartment on the wrong side of the city, taking the public bus to work every morning because his luxury leased SUV had been aggressively repossessed. He was a hollowed-out, exhausted shell, completely stripped of the arrogant charm that had defined his entire existence. He spent his days lacing up sneakers for teenagers who used to admire him. Calvin and Yvonne had managed to keep their large colonial house, but they had lost absolutely everything else in the process. The severance agreement they signed to save themselves had severed the only dynamic that gave their lives any actual meaning. They could no longer parade Jamal around the country club as their ultimate achievement. In fact, they could no longer afford the country club at all. The exorbitant legal fees from restructuring their assets, combined with the total loss of their social standing once the truth about Jamal's bankruptcy leaked to their wealthy neighbors, rendered them social pariahs. Their friends stopped calling. The dinner party invitations dried up. They lived entirely alone in that massive, echoing house, trapped in a loveless marriage held together only by mutual shame and shared resentment. They had traded their beloved son for their brick and mortar, and they were spending their twilight years drowning in the terrible silence of their empty formal dining room. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the rich, dark flavor coat my tongue. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the morning sky in brilliant sweeping strokes of gold pink and vibrant violet. The ocean stretched out endlessly before me, an untamed, beautiful expanse of absolute freedom. My phone rested on the glass patio table beside me. It vibrated softly against the surface, the screen lighting up to disrupt the peaceful, quiet morning. I glanced down. The caller ID displayed an unknown number, but the area code belonged to my home state. It was the familiar, suffocating area code of the suburban town I had left behind. I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. It was either Yvonne desperate for a financial loan under the guise of wanting to reconnect, or Calvin attempting to exert his long-gone paternal authority to demand assistance. Or perhaps it was Jamal swallowing the last microscopic shred of his pride to beg his discarded sister for a handout to pay his rent. It did not matter who was calling. Their voices, their manufactured problems, and their endless selfish demands no longer belonged in my reality. I had paid my dues, and I had closed their accounts. I reached out and picked up the sleek device. I stared at the flashing numbers for exactly 1 second. Without a single trace of hesitation, without a single heartbeat of guilt or regret, I tapped the red block button. The screen went instantly black. I set the phone face down on the glass table. I turned my attention back to the beautiful horizon, wrapping both hands around my warm ceramic coffee mug. I closed my eyes, tilted my head back, and simply listened to the sound of the ocean.